Halo Winter Thrones S01 Chapters 00 to 12. Author Zephyr Audiobook. Production Zephyr Audiobook. Reborn YouTube channel Zephyr Audiobook. Reborn synopsis. 2 eras of war. One catastrophic awakening. When a violent and unnatural slipspace anomaly tears the Unsk infinity from the void, the 3-mile-long flagship crash lands in the frozen wilderness beyond the wall in Westeros. Stranded in a primitive world of feudal lords, steel swords, and ancient superstitions, Master Chief John 1-17, Captain Thomas Lasky, and the surviving Unsk forces must secure their shattered vessel against a lethal, sub-zero environment. But they are not alone in the dark, as the Spartans forge a fragile alliance with Jon Snow and the desperate brothers of the Night's Watch at Castle Black. The arrival of futuristic military technology sends shockwaves across the world. In King's Landing, Eddard Stark watches in horror as the Southern Lords, driven by Cersei Lannister and Petyr Baelish, plot to weaponize the Star Warriors for their petty political games, utterly blind to the true threat in the north. Across the narrow sea, the immense energy of the fallen ship reaches Daenerys Targaryen, causing her petrified dragon eggs to burn with sudden violent life. The Infinity did not merely crash, it turned the key. The exotic slipspace radiation bleeding from the ship's reactors has interacted with the planet's dormant magical network, triggering a devastating planetary defense protocol known as the Long Night Signal. The White Walkers are no longer just a mythic army of the dead. They are a highly intelligent, rapidly adapting force executing a planetary purge. As the undead legions mobilize in biblical numbers to test the Master Chief's shields and the Unsk dwindling ammunition, a colossal and ancient power stirs deep beneath the ice. The wall is cracking. The dragons are waking. The ultimate war for survival has begun, and the green-armored giant of the stars stands as the final shield between the realms of men and an endless apocalyptic winter. Chapter 00. Prologue. The slipspace storm. The void between stars was never silent. Under standard parameters, slipspace was a roaring ocean of exotic radiation, a tempest of shifting dimensional currents that humanity had long ago learned to tame. It was a realm governed by strict, unforgiving mathematics, navigated by superluminal drives and artificial intelligence. But now the math was bleeding. Now the void was screaming. Aboard the Unsk Infinity, the largest and most heavily armed vessel in the history of the United Earth government, reality itself was beginning to fracture. Violent, unnatural tremors tore through the 3-mile-long titanium superstructure. Deep within the belly of the dreadnought, the primary fusion reactors shrieked, an oscillating, heavy bass drone that vibrated through the deck plates and into the bones of every soul aboard. Warning sirens wailed in a relentless mechanical cadence. The corridors were drenched in the stark, bloody glow of red emergency lighting. Outside the heavy viewport of the bridge, the slipspace corridor was collapsing. What should have been a smooth, pitch-black tunnel of folded space had deformed into fractured rivers of blue slipspace lightning. Impossible geometry twisted violently in the dark. Vast, jagged rifts of luminous violet and blinding white tore through the void, lashing against the Infinity's heavy energy shielding with the force of dying stars. On the bridge, the atmosphere was a suffocating blend of adrenaline, panic, and iron discipline. Flickering holograms cast erratic blue light across the faces of the tactical officers. They were military elites, handpicked for the flagship, yet their hands flew across their consoles with a desperate, frantic energy. "We've lost Vector control," a navigation officer shouted over the deafening groan of buckling bulkheads. "Dimensional telemetry is completely corrupted. Gravity fluctuations spanning decks 4 through 12. Captain Thomas Lasky stood at the center of the command holotuple, his hands gripped tightly onto the metallic ring. His uniform was immaculate, his expression carved from stone, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the severity of the crisis. "Reroute all auxiliary power to the structural integrity field," Lasky ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos with absolute, unwavering authority. "Lock down the reactor feeds. Try to stabilize the Shore Fujikawa drive before we get torn apart." "Drive sync is failing, Captain," the operations lieutenant reported, his voice tight. "We're picking up I don't know what this is. Anomalous frequencies bleeding into the communications channels. It's not Covenant. It's not Banished. Is it Foreigner?" Lasky asked. "Negative, sir. The architecture of the signal, it shouldn't exist. It's defying base-level physics." From the overhead comms, Commander Sarah Palmer's voice cut into the tactical net, sharp and completely devoid of fear. "Captain, I've got Spartans in the cryo bays waking up to a hard shake. Armor bays are reporting primary power loss." "What's the play?" Lasky watched a holographic projection of the Infinity flash with red warning runes. "Get them armored, Commander. Lock everyone into the drop bays and brace for impact. We might be looking at a forced real space translation. If we drop out blind, I need the Spartan room and fall ready for anything." "Copy that. Palmer out." Deep within the cavernous expanse of Deck 114, Master Chief Petty Officer John 1-17 stood anchored to the shivering deck plates. He was completely silent. The violent, fractured blue slipspace lightning flashing outside the nearest armored viewport danced across his gold-mirrored visor. His olive-drab Mjolnir armor was a towering silhouette of lethal, mechanical perfection, but beneath the titanium plating there was a quiet, suffocating exhaustion. Cortana was gone. The emotional void she had left behind was a phantom limb, an ache he ruthlessly suppressed beneath decades of indoctrination and war. Sometimes, in the quiet of cryo or the static of a dying comm channel, he thought he could still hear the ghost signals of her voice. He ignored them. He had a duty. He had a mission. He felt the steel vibrations of the ship rising through his boots. The Infinity was dying. He knew the feeling of a failing ship intimately. Inside the chilling architecture of his neural lace, a new presence stirred. The weapon materialized on his heads-up display as a flickering blue avatar. Her digital form was glitching slightly, heavily affected by the catastrophic magnetic distortions tearing through the ship. Normally bright, intelligent, and relentlessly optimistic, the young AI was completely still. "Chief," she began, her voice barely a whisper against the roaring static of the comms. "I can't identify the readings outside." "Explain," the Master Chief responded, his deep, gravely voice perfectly calm. "Minimal. Sorry, the physics aren't behaving normally," the weapon admitted, her holographic hands trembling as she processed trillions of calculations per second, only for all of them to fail. The mathematics governing this slip-space corridor just stopped. The rules of thermodynamics, gravity, spatial relativity are being rewritten in real time. "We aren't flying anymore. What are we doing?" "We are being pulled." On the bridge, the main forward view screen warped violently. The dark, swirling violet of the slipspace tunnel tore completely open, revealing a massive frozen white fracture. It was not the familiar darkness of the universe, but an icy, luminous emptiness. Reality itself seemed to be folding inward, collapsing into a singular, impossible singularity. Strange whispers began to bleed out of the bridge's audio receivers. They sounded like grinding ice, ancient and hollow. It was a frequency of pure, cosmic dread, the sound of an ancient hunger waking from a long slumber. The Infinity shuddered, its massive engines burning at maximum output, yet it was dragged forward like helpless prey being pulled into the black depths of an ocean. "Captain," the nav officer screamed, "we're crossing the event horizon of the anomaly. I can't stop it." "Brace for Lasky," started. The universe shattered. There was a catastrophic visual collapse. The blinding blue light of the slipspace rupture stretched into infinity, snapping like a broken spine. A deafening, absolute roar of collapsing light consumed the dreadnought. Systems died. The red emergency lights blew out in a shower of sparks. Gravity failed. And then there was only silence. The terrifying, suffocating blackness of the unknown. Far away, across the boundary of dimensions, the air was bitter and utterly devoid of mercy. Beyond the wall, the haunted forest stood in absolute frozen stillness. Skeletal trees, black and rotting with age, reached their twisted branches toward a starless, bruised sky. The snow was deep, an endless ocean of white that swallowed the sounds of the world. It was a place untouched by time, ruled by the ancient laws of ice and death. 3 riders of the Night's Watch moved through the suffocating darkness. They wore heavy cloaks of black wool and boiled leather, their faces wrapped against the biting wind. The unnatural cold gnawed at their bones, a freezing ache that felt less like weather and more like a physical presence. Their horses nickered in blind terror, breath pluming in thick, ragged clouds of white vapor. The animals tossed their heads, fighting the iron bits in their mouths, desperate to turn back south. "Teddy," the lead ranger hissed, his gloved hand gripping the pommel of his iron sword. "Teddy, you brute." He peered into the black tree line, his heart hammering against his ribs. The forest was too quiet. There were no owls, no wolves, no wind rattling the dead leaves. Only an oppressive, heavy silence that made the steel in his scabbard feel entirely useless. "We should turn back," the youngest ranger whispered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "The wildlings are gone. There's nothing out here but the cold. The horses feel it." We swore an oath, the veteran growled, though his own eyes darted nervously toward the shadows. "We don't turn back until we find where the camps went." Suddenly the horses screamed. It was not a whinny of discomfort, but a visceral, blood-curdling shriek of primal terror. The animals reared, kicking wildly at the snow. The veteran ranger looked up, and the breath stopped in his lungs. The heavens were splitting apart. High above the black canopy of the haunted forest, the night sky tore open in a jagged, bleeding wound of blue cosmic fire. The sheer scale of the anomaly defied the comprehension of the mortal mind. It was as if the eye of an angry god had opened in the dark. A sound followed, a booming, cataclysmic roar of distant thunder that shook the earth so violently the snow beneath their boots cracked and shifted. It was the sound of the atmosphere being shredded. From the burning blue rifts a mountain of iron descended. The Unsk Infinity, 3 miles of scorched, burning titanium, plummeted from the sky. It was wrapped in a halo of atmospheric fire, trailing miles of black smoke and venting plasma. To the men of the Night's Watch who knew only swords and stone, it was a dragon of unimaginable scale. It was a demon cast down from the heavens, burning with the wrath of 1,000 suns. The sheer kinetic force of its descent parted the clouds. The sonic boom hit the forest. A moment later, a physical wall of air that snapped ancient 100-foot pine trees like fragile twigs. The rangers were thrown from their horses, tumbling into the deep snow as the world dissolved into a cacophony of roaring fire and screaming wind. The colossal starship hit the earth miles to the north, crashing into the jagged peaks of the Frostfangs. The impact was apocalyptic. Glaciers that had stood for 10,000 years shattered into millions of tons of ice and rock. A tidal wave of earth, snow, and fire was thrown miles into the freezing air, painting the blizzard in a hellish, luminescent orange. The ground rolled like an ocean wave, knocking the surviving rangers to their knees. For a long, terrifying minute, the world rumbled with the aftershocks of the impact. The glow of the distant fires illuminated the falling snow, casting long, dancing shadows through the skeletal trees. The veteran ranger pulled himself up from the snow bank, his face pale, his mind broken by the impossible scale of what he had just witnessed. "The gods," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The gods have fallen." He scrambled backward, abandoning his sword, and ran. The rangers fled blindly into the dark, sprinting south toward the wall, driven by a fear so pure it erased all thought. But as the noise of their desperate retreat faded, the silence returned to the haunted forest. A different kind of silence. The cold intensified. It was no longer just the chill of a winter night. It was a primordial, predatory frost that crept across the snow, freezing the shattered pine needles and turning the remaining blood of the dead horses to ice. Deep within the darkest shadows of the tree line, movement flickered. Figures stepped out from the black wood. They were tall, gaunt, and moved with a lethal, liquid grace that produced no sound. Their armor was made of reflective, crystalline ice that mirrored the distant, burning fires of the crashed starship. Slowly, beneath the falling snow, a pair of eyes opened. They were the color of a frozen star, burning with a bright, unnatural blue light. The White Walkers stared north, toward the burning mountain of iron. Inside the half-buried wreckage of the Infinity, beneath millions of tons of shattered ice and stone, emergency survival protocols initiated. Pressure seals hissed in the dark. Sparks showered from severed power lines. Metal groaned as it settled into the frozen earth. In the pitch-black corridor of the armory, illuminated only by the faint, rhythmic pulse of a dying emergency strobe, Master Chief John 117 stepped forward. He raised his MA-5D assault rifle, the metallic clack of the charging handle echoing like a gunshot through the silence of the ship. He was preparing for deployment. Beyond the wall, the eternal winter had been broken by the fire of a dying universe. The isolation of Westeros was over. Ancient, unnoble powers were awakening from the ice, but they had never faced a demon forged in the armor of humanity. The sky had fallen, and the true war for the survival of the living had only just begun. Chapter 01. The ship from the stars. The impact had torn a 3-mile trench through the heart of the Frostfangs, a cataclysmic scar of black earth and shattered ice that bled steam into the freezing northern sky. The Unsk Infinity lay half-buried inside the fractured glacial valley, a fallen titan of titanium and obscured geometry. The massive dreadnought groaned, a deep structural respiration that echoed through the mountain peaks like the death rattle of an ancient god. Enormous fires raged across the ruptured primary hull sections, casting a hellish flickering orange glow against the sheer ice cliffs that pinned the ship down. Plumes of toxic black smoke rose into the oncoming snowstorm, choked with the smell of burning polymer, vaporized coolant, and oxidized metal. Along the ventral hangars, damaged blast doors hung loose on shattered hinges, venting superheated steam into the sub-zero air. Emergency beacon arrays flitted erratically beneath the swirling snow, their rhythmic amber flashes swallowed by the vast, oppressive dark of the wilderness. Inside the ship, the air was cold, thin, and tasted of ozone and blood. Set, watch the threshold. Keep that pressure dressing tight on his thigh. The forward staging area of Deck 12 was a gauntlet of organized chaos. The red emergency lights had given way to the stark, harsh glare of portable fusion lanterns illuminating the grit and ash coating the bulkheads. Wounded Marines and Navy personnel lined the corridors, some sitting in stunned silence against the cold steel, others crying out as corpsmen worked frantically by flashlight. Captain Thomas Lasky walked through the triage center, his uniform torn at the shoulder, a dried track of blood matting the hair near his temple. His boots crunched on broken glass and spent fire extinguisher foam. Behind him, Commander Sarah Palmer was already backing orders into a handheld tactical con, her expression hard as flint. "Status on the secondary fusion reactors," Lasky said, his voice hoarse but completely steady. He stopped at a damaged engineering terminal where a lieutenant was desperately trying to bypass a fried matrix. 3 and 4 are completely dead, sir, the technician replied, not looking up from his bleeding fingers. 5 is holding at 12% capacity, but the magnetic containment fields are fluctuating. We're burning through our emergency battery reserves, just keeping the life support stable on the command decks. If we don't get a stable thermal tap or isolate the leak in the cooling lines within 6 hours, the decks below 12 are going to freeze. What about communications? Lasky asked, turning to Palmer. Any response from the escort fleet? The Anvil Gate. The Saratoga. Palmer shook her head, her jaw tight. Nothing but absolute static, Captain. No orbital arrays, no ONSC emergency bands, no local relay signals. The long-range comms are completely dead. Even the slip-space transceiver is gone, not just broken, sir. The system architecture says the background mathematics for the network don't exist anymore. Lasky looked down at the holotable. It flickered, trying to project a map of their surroundings, but instead displayed only a jagged, nonsensical topography. We aren't just off course, Commander. Look at the barometric pressure outside. The nitrogen-oxygen mix. It's Earth normal, but the star chart data is completely blank. The navigation computers can't find a single known constellation. We're blind in a blizzard, stranded on an unregistered rock, Palmer muttered, her hand resting on her sidearm. And our supplies are localized to whatever survived the impact in Hangar Bay 4. We've got ammunition limitations, limited fuel for the Pelicans, and zero orbital support. If someone is out there, we treat them as hostile until proven otherwise, Lasky interrupted calmly. Establish a hard perimeter. Get the remaining automated defense turrets online along the hull. We survive first, then we figure out where we are. A sudden, palpable shift moved through the crowded corridor. The low murmur of panicked voices and the groans of the wounded died away, replaced by a sudden, reverent quiet. The Master Chief stepped through the ruptured bulkhead. He moved with an impossible, heavy grace, a 7-foot silhouette of scarred olive Rabenjolnir armor that seemed to absorb the dim emergency lights. The golden visor of his helmet was scratched or smeared with carbon score marks from the atmospheric entry, but his presence alone acted as an anchor for every drifting soul on the deck. Marines sat up straighter as he passed. A wounded private stopped, clutching his mangled arm, his eyes widening with a sudden, desperate injection of hope. John Wannington didn't look at them, but his tactical awareness recorded every injury, every broken rifle, every tremor of fear. His own armor was cold to the touch, the internal thermal regulators humming at their limit to fight off the unnatural, biting chill seeping into the ship from the hull breaches. Captain, Chief said, halting before Lasky. Chief, Lasky said, a faint, weary smile touching his lips. Good to see you standing. How's the internal suit diagnostic? Shields are functional. Primary systems at 90%. Weapon is online. Inside John's helmet, a soft blue light blinked. The weapon's avatar materialized on his peripheral display, her expression uncharacteristically subdued. Her usual youthful energy was gone, replaced by a quiet, analytical focus that bordered on dread. I've run the stellar data through every database from the Ark to reach the weapon, said, her voice echoing in John's auditory cortex. Nothing matches. The local gravity is 1.02 g, but there are micro-fluctuations in the ambient electromagnetic field that shouldn't be possible without a foreigner installation present. Except I'm not detecting any foreigner network signatures. No slip-space tendrils, no monitors. Just an ancient, low-frequency resonance beneath the ice. It's like the planet itself is humming, but the math is all wrong. Can you find our position? Chief asked mentally. No, she admitted, her voice dropping. I can't even confirm we're in the Orion Arm, or our own galaxy. The physics out there, they aren't behaving like known reality, Chief. It's like the rules were written by someone else. John looked toward the open hangar bay ahead, where the freezing wind was beginning to howl through the gaps in the titanium hull. Then we recon. I'm sending Fighting Crimson to secure the eastern ridge, Palmer said, stepping up to the Chief. But I need you on the northern approach, Chief. The impact sensor grid picked up faint movement near the tree line before the power grid failed. Could be local wildlife, could be something else. We need eyes on the ground. Understood, Chief said. I'll take a standard survival loadout. 3 mags for the rifle, 1 sidearm. What's your 6 out there, John? Lasky said softly, his eyes reflecting the dark, uncertain valley outside. We don't know what kind of world we just woke up. 5 miles to the south, beneath the ancient, tangled canopy of the haunted forest, the world was bleeding cold. Gerd clutched the reins of his horse, his fingers so numb within his leather gloves that he could no longer feel the leather. His mount was shivering violently, its black coat white with frost, its eyes wide with a rolling, frantic terror that no amount of coaxing could soothe. Look at the sky, Sir Waymar Royce whispered, his voice sharp with a noble's arrogance, though his pale face was slick with a cold sweat. His fine sable cloak was dusted with snow, his sword held loosely in his hand. That was no shooting star. It was a mountain of iron. I saw the fire of it. It was a demon, Will said, crouching low behind a rotting, ice-slicked log. He was a small man, a veteran tracker who had spent half his life in the dark woods beyond the wall, but he had never known a night like this. The sky split wide, Sir Waymer. It didn't drop like a stone, it flew. It roared like 1,000 dragons before it hit the northern peaks. The old gods are weeping fire. The wildlings are dead, Gerd muttered, his teeth chattering so hard he nearly bit his tongue. We found the camp, cleaned out, not a drop of blood on the snow. Their bodies gone. And then the sky falls. We should ride for the wall. Lord Commander Mormont needs to know. The king needs to know. We do not flee from noises in the dark, Waymer Royce commanded, though he turned his horse toward the north, where a faint, eerie orange glow painted the belly of the clouds. We see what fell. If the wildlings have some new engine from the deep north, some sorcery from the wild, the watch must know its shape. Suddenly a low mechanical thrum groaned through the trees. It was a distant, rhythmic beating thump-thump-thump that sliced through the howling wind. Through the thick flurry of snow, an iron beast emerged from the clouds. It had no wings, yet it flew, its twin black bellies roaring with an unearthly blue light that scorched the treetops. 2 green eyes burned on its snout, sweeping the forest floor with blinding pillars of white light. To the rangers it looked like a great, iron dragon, its skin made of dark, unpolished slate, screaming as it hunted the dark. The horses broke. Waymer's mount reared with a terrified scream, throwing the young lord into a snowbank before bolting into the blackwoods. Gerd's horse followed, wild-eyed and consumed by the primal instinct to fly from the sky demon. Get down, Will shrieked, pressing his face into the freezing muck as the great iron Berderunsk pelican cruiser, though he had no name for it, passed low over their heads, its thrusters kicking up a blinding cyclone of snow that buried their tracks. When the sound finally faded, drifting toward the mountains, the silence that returned was absolute. Heavy, suffocating. Waymer Royce pushed himself up from the snow, his face bruised, his noble pride shattered into ragged breathing. What manner of magic is this? Not magic, Will whispered, his eyes locked on the tree line behind them. The orange glow from the north was gone, swallowed by a sudden, unnatural fog that rolled through the ancient trunks. The cold, sir. It's coming back. Closer now. The wind died instantly. The distant rumble of the burning statue was cut off as if an immense, invisible hand had been placed over the world. Gerd looked down at his hands. The frost on his gloves was turning to ice, cracking with a tiny crystalline sound. We have to run, he whispered, his eyes wide with a madness that had nothing to do with the iron ship in the stars. We have to run now. He didn't wait for his commander. Gerd turned and ran south, his heavy black cloak trailing in the deep snow, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps as he fled toward the safety of the wall, leaving the other 2 alone in the quiet of the White Death. The Master Chief stepped off the lower hull plate of the Infinity and into the knee-deep snow of the valley. Each step was a heavy, calculated crunch. Behind him, 2 Marines from the 10th Shot Troops moved in a tactical wedge, their MA-5D rifles raised, the tactical flashlights on their barrels cutting through the driving blizzard. Their visors were fogging slightly at the edges, their breathing heavy over the comm net. Keep your intervals, Chief commanded quietly. Watch the ridges. The weapon, anything on thermal? Nothing. Within 50 meters, the weapon reported, her holographic form appearing on his internal HUD, huddled as if she too could feel the cold. But the atmospheric density is rising abnormally. There's a localized temperature drop centered directly ahead of us. It's dropping 3 degrees every 10 seconds, Chief. That's not a weather pattern. It's a localized energy sink. The team moved into the edge of the ancient forest. The trees here were different from any colony world John had seen. They were old, scarred, their wood dense and black like iron. The silence of the forest was thick, an oppressive weight that felt entirely distinct from the sterile quiet of deep space. Here the isolation felt alive. Chief Corporal Perez muttered, his rifle tracking left. Look at the ground. We've got tracks. John knelt in the snow, his massive armored knees sinking into the white. He brushed away the top layer with a heavy gauntlet. The blob was frozen solid, turned into a dark, brittle glass that shattered under his touch. But it wasn't the blood that caught his eye. It was what lay beyond it. 6 human bodies lay in a clearing, or what remained of them. They weren't wildlings or unscrew. They were dressed in heavy, primitive black wool and hardened leather, their limbs severed with terrifying precision. They hadn't been buried, they had been arranged. The limbs and torsos were laid out in a vast, spiraling pattern that rippled outward from a central point, a crude, geometric formation that looked chillingly deliberate. Jesus, Perez whispered, lowering his weapon slightly, his face pale behind his visor. Who did this? Insurrectionists. Covenant. No plasma scoring, Chief observed, his gloved fingers tracing the edge of a severed torso. The cuts are clean, shattered by extreme cold. The bones are cracked from frost, not impact. Chief, the weapon warned, her voice suddenly losing its analytical calm, shifting into a sharp, tight pitch. I'm picking up a biological signature. But it's a skipping. My sensors are registering life, then death, then nothing at all. The ambient temperature just hit -40. John stood up, his rifle instantly rising to his shoulder. Marines defend a circle. Now! The two soldiers snapped into position, their backs to his, their flashlights piercing the swirling white fog. Through the thick flurry of snow 40 meters away, a shadow moved between the black trees. It was tall, impossibly thin, and moved with a fluid, silent grace that didn't disturb the deep drifts on the ground. For a fraction of a second, the light from Perez's rifle caught a pair of eyes that burned with a pale, brilliant blue, like the plasma fire of a Type 25 rifle, but cold. Utterly deathly cold. Target left. Perez yelled, his finger tightening on the trigger. A 3-round burst from his assault rifle tore through the trees, crack, 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 the supersonic rounds chewing through the ancient bark. But when the smoke cleared, there was nothing there. Only the howling wind. Only the shifting snow. Did you hit it? The other Marine demanded, his voice shaking. I had a lock. I swear to God I had a lock. Calm down, Chief said, his voice a low, commanding rumble that instantly suppressed their rising panic. Weapon, did the rounds connect? I don't know, she whispered, her voice laced with an uncharacteristic, profound uncertainty. The sensor data didn't register an impact on tissue. It registered an impact on ice. But whatever it was, it's gone. And Chief, there are more of them. They're tracking us. John turned his head, his visor scanning the dark perimeter. He didn't see them, but he felt it, the distinct, heavy weight of an experienced predator watching from the long shadows. This wasn't a standard military engagement. This was a hunt. We're pulling back to the ship, Chief said, his hands signaling the Marines to move. Slowly! Keep your eyes on the trees. As they retreated toward the burning silhouette of the Infinity, the cold followed them, a silent, ancient presence that seemed to mock the fire of their fallen star. Days later, and hundreds of miles to the south, the cold was different. It was the honest, biting winter of the north, but it lacked the supernatural malice of the deep wilderness. Below the grey stone walls of Winterfell, the morning air was sharp enough to draw blood from the nose. Lord Eddard Stark stood over the kneeling man, his hands resting on the pommel of ice, the massive two-handed greatsword of Valyrian steel. His face was a mask of grim duty, his grey eyes weary but unyielding. Beside him stood his young son, Bran, his face pale with a mixture of awe and fear, flanked by Robb and the quiet, watchful figure of Jon Snow. The deserter from the Night's Watch was an old man, but his spirit had been completely broken. His clothes were ragged, his fingers blackened by frostbite, but it was his eyes that troubled Eddard. They were wide, bloodshot, and rolling in a terminal madness that had nothing to do with the simple fear of the executioner's blade. I saw them, the old man mumbled, his chin slick with frozen drool. I saw the Iron Dragon. I saw the mountain fall from the stars. It burned the sky away. Be still, man, Ned Stark said, his voice deep and solemn. You broke your oath. The penalty is death. The sky fell. The deserter shrieked, his voice rising to a high, pathetic wail that made the horses nearby shift uneasily. The sky fell and the demons came out of the fire. Giants and green iron giants with golden faces. They don't bleed. They don't breathe. The White Walkers have brought a new terror from the stars. You can't kill it. You can't kill the iron. The heavy blade of Valyrian steel came down in a single silent arc. The old man's words were cut off, his head tumbling into the red-stained snow, his dark blood smoking in the freezing morning air. Ned Stark wiped the blade clean with a piece of flannel, his expression heavy with a brooding concern. He turned to his sons, his eyes lingering on Jon. The man was mad. The wild has a way of turning a mind if a ranger stays out too long in the dark. He was terrified, Father, Jon Snow said softly, his purple-grey eyes fixed on the dead man's face.
He wasn't lying about what he thought he saw.
He believed it. A madman believes many things, Jon, Ned said, though he looked toward the northern horizon, where the mountains of the wall lay hidden behind a shroud of thick grey clouds. The night's watch has grown weak and the winters are getting longer. Rumours of iron dragons and green giants are the talk of children. Yet, as they rode back through the gates of Winterfell, a word stayed with them like a cold draught beneath a heavy door. In the courtyard, Tyrion Lannister stood beside his carriage, wrapped in a heavy fur cloak, a skin of sour wine in his hand. He watched the Stark men return, his sharp eyes catching the subtle tension in Ned's shoulders. Word had already begun to filter down from the eastern port, strange tales of a thunder that shook the coast of blue fire seen in the night sky as far south as the Twins. A fallen mountain, Tyrion murmured to himself, taking a long pull from his wineskin. A sky made of fire. The north is an uninspiring place, but it certainly knows how to invent a good story to pass the winter. But far to the north, beyond the wall of ice, the story was real. The Master Chief stood on a high ridge of the Frostfangs, his rifle held across his chest, looking down into the vast, dark expanse of Westeros. The fires of the Infinity still burned behind him, the lone beacon of human technology in a primitive, dying world. He didn't know the names of the kings who ruled these lands, He didn't know the gods they prayed to, but as he stared into the black depths of the forest below, his visor picked up a single pale blue light flickering between the trees, a light that vanished the moment his crosshairs settled upon it. The world was already dying, caught in the grip of an ancient, creeping horror, but humanity had not come to die in the snow. John 1917 turned back toward the ship, his boots sinking into the ice, preparing for a war that would change the fate of two worlds forever. Chapter 02. The King's Road. A bitter, slate-grey dawn crawled over the frost fangs, offering no warmth, only the stark illumination of a world buried in ice. Beyond the wall, the ruined valley had become an industrialized fortress of necessity. The fractured hull of the Unsk Infinity sat like a jagged, iron ridge wedged between shattering glaciers, its torn titanium flanks venting columns of superheated steam that hissed violently against the falling snow. Around the crash site, the perimeter had taken the shape of an emergency firebase. Marines in dirt-streaked battle dress labored under the pale morning light, dragging interlocking titanium barricades into defensive lines, their breath pluming in thick, ragged clouds. High above, a lone Pelican dropship cut through the swirling blizzard, its twin thrusters whining a low, heavy protest against the sub-zero density. The intense thermal heat from the ship's exposed reactor core had melted a wide, black lake of slush around the ventral hull, exposing the raw, primordial rock of Westeros beneath. Inside the primary staging hangar, Commander Sarah Palmer stood before a portable holotable, her armored gauntlets resting on the metallic edge. The projection flickered erratically, distorted by the strange electromagnetic interference that bled from the surrounding peaks. The automated M2020 turrets are deployed along the northern ridge, Palmer reported, her voice clipping through the low-frequency static of the local comms. But the sensor grid is still blind beyond 2 kilometers. Whatever is causing the atmospheric distortion out there, it's chewing right through our localized radar. We're burning through emergency power cells just to keep the perimeter shields from collapsing. Captain Lasky stood beside her, his winter tactical jacket zipped to his throat, his eyes fixed on the blank space where their orbital telemetry should have been. What's our ammunition status, Commander? The armor is on decks 4 and 7 survived, but we're on a strict rationing protocol, Palmer said, her face grim. If we get into a prolonged war of attrition with whatever the chief saw in the woods, standard kinetic rounds aren't going to last. We have no manufacturing capability here, Captain. No supply drops. Every bullet counts. Lasky looked out toward the open hangar bay, where the howling wind carried the distant, mournful cry of a mountain wolf. We aren't just lost, Sarah. The engineers salvaged the navigation core from the secondary bridge. The stars, they aren't matching up with any known sector of human or Covenant space. We're on our own. Completely. Hundreds of miles to the south, the cold was less brutal, but far more melancholic. The King's Road stretched out like a grey ribbon through the ancient, snow-dusted forests of the north. The iron shoes of 100 horses clattered against the frozen mud, a rhythmic, monotonous sound that did nothing to drown out the oppressive silence of the country. Jon Snow rode near the rear of the column, his eyes fixed on the bobbing head of his horse. The heavy, dark fur of his cloak was dusted with ice, the pommel of his sword a familiar weight against his thigh. Behind him, the great white shape of Ghost moved silently through the brush, a phantom in the snow. You look rather bleak, Lord Snow, a voice called out, sharp and mocking yet oddly warm. Jon turned his head to see Tyrion Lannister riding a small, sturdy pony beside him. The dwarf was wrapped in layers of expensive, heavy furs, his mismatched eyes squinting against the pale glare of the morning. "I'm no Lord Tyrion," Jon said quietly, his voice carrying the bitter weight of his status. "I'm a bastard. There's no honor in a name you didn't earn." "Oh, don't look so sour," Tyrion chuckled, pulling a silver flask from his coat. He took a long, slow draught, his breath vaporizing in the crisp air. "Most lords are fools who inherited their titles from greater men who happened to be successful murderers. A bastard has to make his own way. It's far more interesting." Jon didn't reply. His mind was still back at Winterfell, trapped in the memory of the dead ranger's eyes and the shadow that had fallen over his father's face before the greatsword came down. "They are talking about it all the way down from the wall, you know," Tyrion continued, his tone shifting into something more speculative as he leaned forward. "The small folk in the taverns are singing a new tune. Not of dragons or krakens, but of a mountain made of black iron that fell from the heavens. They say the sky tore open like a piece of old silk, and the giants clad in green steel stepped out of the fire." Jon looked at him, his brow furrowed. "My father said the man was mad from the cold. Your father is an honourable man, which means he has a remarkably limited imagination," Tyrion said, tapping the side of his flask against his chin. "A madman mimics the things he fears. But when 3 different travellers from 3 different tracks all speak of a thunder that didn't come from a storm, and a blue fire that burned colder than ice, well, then my curiosity is piqued. A mountain from the stars, Jon. Imagine the architecture. Imagine the history. The Night's Watch doesn't care about history," Jon said, his gaze drifting back to the northern horizon, where the massive shadow of the wall loomed like a dream of ice. They care about the cold, and whatever is waking up inside it. Deep within the haunted forest 30 kilometers north of the Infinity, the cold did not just bite, it hunted. The Master Chief walked in absolute silence, his heavy Mjolnir boots sinking into the virgin snow without a sound. His MA-5D assault rifle was held at the high ready, its tactical light turned off to avoid giving away their position in the pale, fog-choked woods. Behind him, 3 Spartans from Fighting Shadow moved in a flawless tactical wedge, their armor panels reflecting the grey, skeletal trunks of the surrounding trees. "Chief," the weapon's voice whispered within his helmet, a thread of digital anxiety weaving through his neural lace. "The local atmospheric distortions are spiking again."
I'm picking up a profound temperature drop directly ahead, -55°C and falling.
"But there's no wind. The air is completely stagnant." John stopped, raising a hand. The Spartans behind him instantly dropped into low, defensive crouches, their weapons tracking the dark perimeter. Through the thick, unnatural mist, a wildling village appeared. It was a crude settlement of mud huts and hide tents, all of them buried beneath a heavy mantle of snow. There was no smoke rising from the fire pits, no sound of barking dogs, only an immense suffocating silence that muffled even the hum of John's internal armor systems. As they entered the clearing, the visual reality of the clearing hit his tactical HUD. "Multiple casualties," Spartan Tanaka reported over the tight beam radio, her voice flat, professional, but tight with caution. Dozens of wildlings, men, women, and children lay frozen in the central square. They hadn't been sorted by blades or arrows. They were arranged in a vast, intricate spiral that expanded outward from the center of the village. Their eyes were wide, their skin translucent and white like milk, their limbs stiffened into impossible geometric angles. "Weapon," Chief said, his voice a low rumble. "Scan for biological signatures." "I'm trying," she whispered, her avatar glitching slightly on his heads-up display. "The tissue data is it's wrong, Chief. Their cells are completely crystallized, but there's no sign of cellular decay. It's like their life force was stripped away instantaneously. And there's something else. A high-density energy pattern woven into the geometry of the bodies. It's not foreign irradiation. It's like a broadcast network made of ice." Suddenly, the silence fractured. A low, sickening crack echoed through the square. John's visor snapped toward the edge of the spiral. One of the frozen wildling corpses, a woman whose chest had been torn open by the frost, jerked. Her head snapped back with an unnatural, mechanical motion, her joints popping loudly in the freezing air. Then her eyes opened. They were not brown or blue like a normal human's. They were 2 points of brilliant, glowing electric blue burning with a cold, predatory intelligence. "Chief," Tanaka warned, her rifle clicking as she disengaged the safety. "We've got movement, multiple targets." All around the square, the dead began to rise. They did not scream. They did not groan. They moved with a terrifying, silent coordination, their limbs jerking as they pulled themselves from the frozen earth. A shattered warrior, his arm missing from the elbow, grabbed a rusted iron axe with his remaining hand, his glowing blue eyes locked onto the green armor of the Spartans. "Fire," Chief commanded. The clearing exploded into a wall of sound. The 3 Spartans unleashed synchronized control bursts of 7.62 mm armor-piercing ammunition. The supersonic rounds tore through the oncoming horde with devastating force. High-velocity bullets shattered frozen limbs, blew apart skulls, and ripped torsos to ribbons. But they did not stop. A wildling, whose entire midsection had been hollowed out by a burst from Tanaka's rifle, continued to crawl forward, his skeletal fingers tearing through the snow, his blue eyes never wavering. Another took a full burst to the chest, the kinetic impact knocking him backward, only for the corpse to snap back to its feet a second later, completely indifferent to the destruction of its vital organs. "Bullets aren't stopping them," Perez shouted over the comm, his rifle barking as he walked backward, maintaining his distance. "They don't have blood, Chief. There's nothing to bleed out." "Aim for the spine," Chief ordered, his own rifle firing with surgical precision, snapping the neck of an oncoming corpse and dropping it instantly into the snow. "Break their mobility. Move back to the ridge." The engagement was brutal, claustrophobic, and entirely alien to anything the Spartans had faced.
The enemy didn't use tactics, they used numbers and absolute, unyielding resilience.
Then the world froze. An unnatural, suffocating wave of cold rolled through the trees, so intense that the visor on John's helmet flashed an environmental warning icon. Frost immediately began to bloom across the green titanium plates of his Mjolnir armor. The tactical radios hissed with a sudden, overwhelming surge of white noise, the voices of his squad dissolving into distorted static. From the shifting fog at the edge of the village, a figure emerged. It was tall, gaunt, and elegant in its horror. Its skin was the color of pale milk, stretched tight over a skeletal structure that seemed both ancient and timeless. It wore armor that looked like nothing forged by human hands, a shimmering, crystalline material that shifted colors like melting ice, reflecting the pale light of the forest. In its right hand, it held a long, translucent blade of ice that hummed with a low, sub-zero resonance. A White Walker. It didn't join the mindless horde of the dead. It stood at the edge of the tree line, its deep glowing blue eyes studying the Master Chief with a quiet, calculating intelligence. It looked at the assault rifle, the green armor, the golden visor, evaluating this new armored anomaly that had dropped from the stars. John didn't hesitate. He dropped his rifle, letting it hang on its magnetic sling, and drew his N6H Magnum sidearm. He fired 3 high-explosive, armor-piercing rounds directly at the entity's chest. The rounds detonated against the crystalline armor with a sharp crack, but the creature barely stirred. The ice plates cracked, venting a pale white mist, but the wound sealed itself almost instantly. The White Walker moved. It blurred through the snow with an impossible liquid speed, its ice blade whistling through the air in a lethal arc. Chief raised his forearm, the Mjolnir's energy shielding flaring into life just as the icy blade struck. Boom! A violent explosion of blue sparks and white frost erupted between them. The sheer kinetic force of the blow was immense, registering a red spike on John's shield meter, a strike that would have severed a normal man in two. The energy shield crackled, the blue light illuminating the creature's pale, ancient face just inches from John's visor. For a second, the Spartan and the Winter God were locked in a test of pure strength. John could feel the intense cosmic cold bleeding through his gauntlet, threatening to freeze the internal mechanics of his suit. With a low grunt, Chief drove his armored boot into the creature's midsection. The Spartan's enhanced strength held the White Walker backward 5 meters, its crystalline armor cracking against a frozen tree trunk. The creature recovered instantly, standing tall among the shadows. It looked down at its cracked chest plate, where the heat from the shield impact had caused the ice to weep. Then it looked back at John. It did not rage. It simply tilted its head a low, grinding sound like shifting glaciers sliding from its throat to command. The surrounding horde of the dead instantly surged forward, throwing themselves between their master and the Spartans, burying the path in a sea of frozen flesh. Chief, Palmer's voice cracked through a break in the static. We're picking up multiple anomalies moving toward your position. Fall back to the Pelican. Now, John fired a final round into the oncoming crowd, then turned back toward the ridge. Shadow Team, move out. We have what we came for. As they broke through the tree line toward the waiting dropship, John looked back one last time. The White Walker was gone, dissolved back into the mist, but the glowing blue eyes of its army remained, watching them from the dark. Halfway across the world, across the vast, sun-baked expanse of the narrow sea, the air was thick with the scent of roasted goat and dry earth. In the city of Pentos, Daenerys Targaryen sat on the edge of a silk-draped bed, her long, silver-gold hair falling over her shoulders. The heat of the S01 sun was a stark contrast to the dark omens that had begun to drift across the water from the sailors of the west. They speak of a new power, Khaleesi, Sir Jorah Mormont said, standing near the balcony, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. His leather armor was stained with sweat, his eyes fixed on the distant harbor. The traders from Bravos are terrified. They say a great iron palace fell from the heavens into the deep north. They call it the Ship of the Stars. Daenerys looked up, her violet eyes serious, reflecting a maturity that belied her young years. A ship? How can a ship fly through the sky, Jorah? Is it a dragon? No, Khaleesi, Jorah said, his voice dropping into a tense, uneasy whisper. They say it is made of black iron, larger than any castle in 7 kingdoms, and that it carries warriors who wield the thunder itself. The small folk are saying the gods have returned to punish the usurper. Daenerys touched the smooth, petrified surface of the dragon eggs resting in the chest beside her. She felt a faint, thrumming warmth beneath the stone, a whisper of an ancient power that was her birthright. If these warriors are from the stars, do they belong to the usurper, Robert? They belong to no one, Jorah said grimly. They are stranded. But if a single one of those thunder weapons were to find its way into the hands of the great houses, the Iron Throne won't matter. The world itself will change its master. Daenerys turned her gaze back to the eggs, her heart beating with a sudden, heavy sense of destiny. The world is changing, Jorah. I can feel it in the wind. The fire is coming. Back in the frozen valley of the Frostfangs, the Pelican dropship touched down on the Infinity's forward deck plates with a heavy, metallic clang. The rear ramp hissed open, and the Master Chief stepped into the staging area. His armor was covered in a thick layer of blue-tinted frost, his energy shields humming at low capacity as they fought to purge the lingering chill of the encounter. Behind him, the Spartans of Shadow Team moved with a stiff, shaken gait, their weapons empty, their gear scarred by ice. Captain Lasky and Commander Palmer met him at the base of the ramp, their expressions tight with anticipation. Chief, Lasky said, looking at the frost coating the Spartan's breastplate. What did you find out there? John removed his rifle from its sling, handing it to a waiting tech. He looked out through the open hangar doors toward the vast, dark expanse of the haunted forest, where the fog was beginning to settle around the ship like a shroud. The dead chief said, his deep voice carrying an absolute chilling weight that silenced the entire deck.
They don't stay down.
Standard kinetic rounds are ineffective. The weapon materialized on the holatable nearby, her digital form trembling slightly as she uploaded the tactical data into the ship's remaining mainframe. It's not an insurrection, Captain. It's an extinction event. Whatever is out there in the dark, it's already hunting this world. Lasky looked at Palmer, then back at the giant in green armor. The reality of their situation was settling into his bones. They were trapped on a dying world with a broken ship, limited ammunition, and an enemy that didn't know how to die. John 117 turned his golden visor toward the north, where the pale blue eyes of the winter gods were waiting for the fires of the infinity to go out. This world, Chief said softly, the steel in his voice unyielding, is already at war. Chapter 03. The Wall of Men. The wall did not merely defy the sky, it seemed to hold it up, a 700-foot precipice of weeping ice, an ancient stone that vanished into the roiling, slate-grey belly of the northern storm.
At its base, Castle Black clung to the frozen earth like a scattering of black teeth, its timber long since rotted, its stone keep slick with centuries of frost. Tonight, the wind did not blow, it screamed. Torches lashed violently against the timber beams of the courtyard, casting erratic, dancing shadows across the faces of the brothers of the Night's Watch.
They stood up on the battlements, shivering beneath waterlogged clogs of boiled leather and matted sheepskin, their knuckles white upon the pommels of dull iron swords.
For thousands of years, their eyes had scanned the dark boundary of the haunted forest for wildlings and the cold myths of their childhood. Tonight, they watched the horizon for something far worse. Whispers had outrun the wind. Stories of an iron mountain falling from the firmament, of green-skinned demons who walked through fire and thunder weapons that tore the night apart had turned the black-clad scavengers and thieves into terrified children.
And now, the anomalies were closer.
Beyond the frozen canopy to the north, faint, rhythmic pulses of unnatural blue light rippled through the storm clouds, a cold, artificial lightning that left a taste of copper on the tongue. Then came the thunder. It was not the rolling roar of a storm, but the sharp, mechanical whine of a beast cutting through the blizzard.
From the darkness above the courtyard, a shadow descended.
To the men of the watch, it was a dragon forged from slate-coloured iron, its twin bellies burning with columns of blinding blue plasma fire.
The sheer downwash of the pelican's thrusters sent a tempest of loose ice and gravel tearing across the courtyard, knocking two men from their feet and sending horses screaming inside their timber stables. The iron beast touched down with a heavy, pressurized hiss. Before the snow could even settle, the rear ramp ground open. A dozen Unsk Marines moved out in a textbook tactical spread, their charcoal grey battle armor gleaming under the torchlight, the digital optics on their helmets tracking the stone towers with precise, lethal efficiency.
Behind them, heavy boots stepped onto the slush.
Portable fusion generators brought down from the Infinity's auxiliary base were dropped onto the ancient flagstones, their low, high-frequency hum instantly vibrating through the foundations of the castle.
Portable floodlights snapped to life, bathing the medieval courtyard in a harsh, unforgiving white glare that made the flickering torches look like dying embers.
From the steps of the Lord Commander's quarters, Joe Norman watched the invasion of his world.
His great bare fur cloak was heavy with ice, his weathered face carved with deep lines of exhaustion and suspicion. His hand remained gripped on his belt near the iron pommel of his sword as he watched these men from another world unload crates of grey titanium and glowing plasma cells into the home of the Watch.
They looked like gods, Samuel Tully whispered, his teeth chattering as he huddled behind Jon Snow in the shadow of the armory wall.
Sam's wide eyes were fixed on a Marine who was mounting an automated defense turret onto a timber barricade, its triple barrel swiveling with a smooth robotic clicking.
Or sorcerers. Look at their eyes, John. They shine like the stars.
Not sorcerers, John said softly.
His purple-grey eyes were locked not on the Marines, but on the massive shape emerging last from the dropship.
The Master Chief stepped into the torchlight. He was a monument of scarred olive-wrapped titanium, his Mjolnir armor caked with the frozen blue mud of the northern valley.
His golden visor reflected the ancient stone of the keeps, completely obscuring any trace of humanity beneath.
He didn't look at the men staring at him. His gaze went immediately upward, tracing the impossible verticality of the wall. His tactical HUD mapped the structure in seconds, recording stress fractures, density anomalies, and structural integrity parameters that defied every known law of architectural engineering. Lord Commander, Captain Lasky said, stepping forward from the Pelican's shadow. His face was pale, his breath forming thick clouds in the sub-zero air, but his stance was that of a commander who still held a line.
Thank you for the berth.
My men are secure in the perimeter, as agreed.
Mormont stepped down the wooden stairs, his boots crunching on the slush. He stopped 3 paces from Lasky, his gaze drifting up to the silent Spartan standing behind the captain.
We gave you our courtyard, Captain, because the wild has gone mad and my rangers are dying in the dark.
But my men are superstitious.
They see your iron birds and your shining armor, and they think the end of days has come.
The end of days might not be far off, Lasky replied grimly. He gestured to a portable holotable that had been set up beneath a timber lean-to.
With a soft chime, a three-dimensional blue projection of the Frostfang Mountains flickered into existence, casting a pale light across Mormont's weathered face.
Our scouts confirmed it.
An organized force is moving south.
They aren't wildlings. They don't have thermal signatures, and they don't bleed. Mormont stared at the moving blue dots on the hologram, his jaw tightening.
The White Walkers, the old stories the Grumpkins and Snarks the Southern Lords laugh at.
He looked up, his grey eyes piercing Lasky. Can your thunder weapons kill them? We can destroy the flesh. Master Chief's deep, gravely voice cut through the wind, making Mormont flinch slightly.
It was a voice that belonged to a machine, steady and devoid of doubt.
But they don't stop. They don't tire.
We need to know what commands them. Then you'll need to understand this country, Spartan, Mormont said, turning his back to the wind.
And this country doesn't yield to iron. The following morning brought no sun, only a uniform, leaden sky that made the ice of the wall gleam with an eerie, translucent blue.
In the long yard,
the contrast between two civilizations was absolute.
On one side, Night's Watch recruits trained with heavy, blunt iron broadswords, their movements clumsy and slowed by the weight of their woolens. On the other, a squad of Spartan Roman 4 from Palmer's detachment conducted synchronized tactical drills.
Jon Snow stood by the wooden railing, ignoring the cold that snaked through his black cloak. He watched a female Spartan, a towering figure in crimson armor, demonstrate a close-quarters disarm. Her movements were blindingly fast, a fluid blur of kinetic energy that ended with her training partner slammed onto the frozen earth with a bone-shattering thud.
They don't waste a breath, Jon muttered.
They don't have to, a voice responded. Jon turned to find the Master Chief standing beside him.
The Spartan was working on his MA-5D rifle, his massive gauntlets handling the delicate internal spring mechanism with a precision that seemed impossible for his size. He didn't look at Jon, but his visor was tilted slightly toward the yard.
Your men fight with fear, Chief said, his tone matter-of-fact. It makes them slow. It makes them predictable. They are thieves and rapists mostly, Jon said, a bitter edge to his voice.
Sent here to die because the realm has no use for them. They fight because they have nowhere else to run.
Chief paused, his gauntlet snapping the upper receiver of the rifle back into place with a sharp, metallic clack. The weapon doesn't care where it was forged.
Only if it holds its edge. He turned his golden visor fully toward Jon.
I watched you train your men yesterday. You have discipline. You look after your squad.
They are my squad, Jon said, looking away, his thoughts drifting to his bastard status, to the cold looks from Lady Stark that had chased him to this frozen edge of the world.
They are my brothers. We're all the same here. No names, no lands.
That's a military unit, Chief said simply. Hold on to that.
When the line breaks, the person next to you is the only thing that keeps you alive.
Jon looked back at the giant, a quiet, profound respect settling into his chest.
He didn't understand the magic that powered the giant's armor, or the stars he claimed to have fallen from, but he understood honor. He understood a man who lived for the shield wall.
Will you stand with us when they come?
I stand where the line needs me, Chief replied.
Deep within the subterranean vaults of Castle Black, where the heat from the surface couldn't reach, Samuel Tarly sat huddled over an ancient timber table. The air down here smelled of damp earth, tallow candles, and disintegrating parchment. But tonight, the darkness was broken by a soft, ethereal blue light.
The weapon's miniature form hovered above a small, portable data pad she had linked to the ship's primary mainframe.
Her digital eyes were wide, flashing with thousands of lines of encrypted script as she analyzed the ancient, mouldering scroll Sam had unearthed from the lowest bins.
It's infuriating, the weapon said, her voice small and crisp in the echoing stone vault. She stomped her holographic foot in frustration. There's no logic to these texts.
Look at this one, it describes a winter that lasted a generation, but the meteorological data is completely missing.
It just says the shadows grew long in the sun.
That's not a weather report, Sam.
That's poetry.
It's its history, my lady, Sam stammered, his face flushed as he held a candle closer to a torn piece of sheepskin.
He was terrified of the tiny blue woman,
yet his scholarly obsession had overcome his fear hours ago.
This scroll dates back to the Age of Heroes.
It speaks of the long night.
Look here where the ink has faded. It talks of the last hero searching for the children of the forest. And look at this drawing.
He pointed a shaking finger at a crude charcoal sketch of a figure standing before a massive, bleeding tree.
The weapon leaned closer, her sensor scanning the ancient parchment. Suddenly, her digital form glitched, a static hiss rippling through her projection.
Sam looked at the geometric pattern around the border of that drawing. It's a recurring sequence of prime numbers. The exact same frequency I detected in the electromagnetic field around that carved white tree beyond the wall.
She turned around, her face serious, the youthful optimism completely gone from her eyes.
I ran a deep thermal scan of the wall itself through the ship's sensors this morning.
Sounds that ice isn't natural.
There are localized gravitational inversions buried 20 meters deep inside the structure.
It's holding back a massive negative energy field that extends all the way to the polar cap. If the ice melts, the structural resonance will collapse.
It's not a wall, it's a dampening field.
The prison.
Sam stared at her, his candle trembling so much that hot wax spilled onto his thumb.
A prison for what? For whatever is creating those biological anomalies, the weapon said softly, her image flickering as a distant tremor shook the stone ceiling.
The White Walkers aren't a species, Sam.
They are a corruption, and they are adapting to our technology. My sensors are picking up a complete breakdown of our local radio relays. The closer they get, the more our science fails.
The horror returned to Castle Black just before midnight.
A horn blew from the top of the wall, a single, long, mournful blast that chilled the blood of every man who heard it. The Rangers. Jon Snow was the first through the armory doors, his sword already drawn. Chief followed, his Enjolnir armor a silent shadow that outpaced the running guards.
At the northern gate, where the massive iron tunnel cut through the base of the wall, a small crowd had gathered.
2 horses had collapsed in the slush, their coats covered in a thick, unnatural frost, their lungs rattling with their final freezing breaths.
Only one man remained in the saddle.
It was Cotter Pike, his face black with frostbite,
his eyes wide and vacant
as he stared into the torchlight.
His hands were frozen to the reins, the leather literally bonded to his skin by the ice. There standing, Pike whispered, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like wind over dead leaves.
They don't move.
They just stand in the storm and watch.
The trees went quiet. No birds.
No wolves.
Just the cold. Where is the rest of your patrol, Cotter? Mormont demanded, grabbing the man's stirrup, his face pale.
They're part of it now, Pike said, a terrible, mad smile breaking across his cracked lips.
They are standing with them, in the dark. They have the blue eyes, Lord Commander, even the little ones. They are coming to see the iron ship. He collapsed forward,
his body stiff as a log, his spirit breaking before he hit the ground.
Chief, the weapon's voice snapped inside Jon's helmet, sharp and urgent.
Our perimeter motion sensors along the lower shelf just went dead.
Not jam destroyed.
The ambient temperature outside the gate just dropped 20 degrees in 3 seconds.
My internal diagnostic is reporting a critical failure in our short-range radar arrays.
Jon walked past the shouting men, his visor locked on the heavy iron doors that seal the tunnel through the wall. He could hear it now, a faint, rhythmic scratching against the iron from the other side. It sounded like thousands of skeletal fingernails scraping against the cold metal, a relentless, mindless pressure that made the massive oak timbers groan. Get the Marines to the gate, Chief ordered Palmer over the tactical net. The wall is compromised. An hour later, the storm reached its zenith. Master Chief stood at the very top of the wall, his boots anchored to the ice as the wind tried to tear him from the precipice. Beside him, Jon Snow stood with his cloak wrapped tight around his face, his eyes squinting into the blinding white fury of the blizzard below.
The endless expanse of the haunted forest stretched out toward the north, a vast ocean of black trees buried in white.
But tonight, the forest was alive with a different light. Far beyond the tree line, thousands of pale blue points of light were moving through the dark. They looked like a constellation of dead stars that had fallen into the snow, a slow, crawling sea of frost that was converging on Castle Black.
The motion sensors on Jon's HUD flickered and died, unable to process the sheer volume of the negative energy field rising from the valley.
They are testing us, Jon said, his voice swallowed by the roar of the wind. They know you're here. They've never come this close to the wall in 1,000 years. They are studying our perimeter, Chief responded, his visor zooming in on a distant ridge. Through the thermal optics, the world was devoid of blue and white, but through the high-resolution zoom he saw them. 3 figures stood on the highest peak, their crystalline armor reflecting the pale light of the storm. They did not move. They simply stood like statues of ancient ice, their glowing blue eyes fixed entirely on the green giant standing upon the barrier of man. The weapon appeared on his display, her small form looking up at the vast, dark sky above them.
Chief, I managed to isolate the resonance beneath the ice.
It's old, older than humanity, older than the Foreigners. This world isn't just a planet.
It's a graveyard, and whatever is buried here is finally waking up. Jon 117 didn't answer.
He adjusted the strap of his rifle, his golden visor locked onto the ancient kings of winter waiting in the dark. The White Walkers were adapting, learning the shape of their new enemy's steel, and the true winter was no longer coming. It had arrived. Chapter 04 Lions and Rifles. The blizzard did not merely fall upon Castle Black, it battered the ancient fortress like an invading army.
Sheets of driving, crystalline snow slammed against the black stone keeps hissing as they met the unnatural, blinding glare of Unsk floodlights.
The massive pillars of white light cut through the howling dark, illuminating a courtyard transformed.
Beside the sagging wooden towers
And rotting timber stables of the Night's Watch, titanium-armored barricades had been erected in precise tactical vectors.
Portable fusion generators hummed with a deep, subterranean vibration that vibrated through the frozen earth, melting the surrounding ice into black pools of slush.
Near the armory, a Pelican dropship sat like a crouched iron gargoyle, its armored hull frosted white, its twin thrusters venting thin trails of superheated plasma that distorted the freezing air.
Marines in heavy charcoal battle dress moved with disciplined speed, their boots crunching loudly on the slush as they hauled crates of 7.62mm ammunition and automated defense components.
Watching them from the shadows of the timber overhangs were the brothers of the watch huddled, shivering men wrapped in matted sheepskins, their eyes wide with a mixture of religious awe and absolute terror.
To them, the humming machines and the silent, faceless soldiers were not allies, they were demons born of a fallen star.
The heavy oak gates of the castle groaned open, fighting the weight of the wind, and a small caravan of horses stumbled into the courtyard.
Tyrion Lannister pulled his heavy sable cloak tighter around his neck, his face pale and slick with frozen sweat as he slid awkwardly from his mount.
He looked up, and for the first time in his life the sarcastic wit that had served as his armor failed him. He did not see the pathetic, forgotten outburst his brother Jaime had described.
He saw a collision of two worlds.
The massive 700-foot wall of ice towered above them, but beneath it, the stark, futuristic geometry of the Unsk outposts cut into the medieval stonework like a foreign blade.
"Gods protect us," murmured Morik, one of Tyrion's personal guards, his hand shaking on his horse's reins as he stared at an automated M2020 turret swiveling silently atop a wooden wall.
The stories were true.
"It's sorcery."
"Not sorcery, my dear Morik," Tyrion said, his voice returning, though it lacked its usual careless bite.
He adjusted his stance, his mismatched eyes sweeping across the glowing tactical displays and the armored soldiers.
"Sorcery is fickle. This is mathematics with an iron edge,
and it changes everything."
Tyrion walked forward, his short legs working hard through the deep slush.
He watched a Marine lieutenant review a hovering blue hologram of the surrounding terrain, the light reflecting off the soldier's visor.
Tyrion's mind, always sharp, always calculating, immediately began to spin.
He did not see mere travelers, he saw an unprecedented military power.
If these stout warriors possessed weapons that could command thunder and iron birds, that could fly through winter storms, the petty squabbles of the Seven Kingdoms, the paranoias of his sister, the debts of the crown would be rendered utterly meaningless. The balance of power in Westeros had not just shifted, the board had been smashed to pieces. Lord Lannister, Jorah Mormont called out, stepping down from the wooden stairs of the King's Tower.
His beard was frosted white, his expression grim.
"You chose a terrible night to see the edge of the world." "I find the terrible nights are usually the most educational, Lord Commander," Tyrion replied, shaking the snow from his furs. "Where is the master of this iron palace?"
"I was told a giant led them." "He is inside," Mormont said, gesturing toward the dark, narrow stone corridor of the keep. "But be careful with your tongue, Lannister."
"He is not a man who values courtly jests." The interior of the keep smelled of damp stone, burning pine tallow, and the sharp chemical ozone of Unsk electronics. Tyrion entered the room, his boots clanking on the stone floor.
He had expected a warlord.
He had expected a monster, or perhaps a king adorned in metals unknown to the Citadel.
Instead, he met a silent soldier. The Master Chief stood at the center of the dark chamber, illuminated only by a single tallow candle and the soft, blue glow of a tactical datapad.
He was colossal. In his green Enjolnir armor, he towered over Tyrion, a silent mountain of scarred titanium and cold military purpose.
The gold-mirrored visor of his helmet was completely opaque, reflecting the flickering candlelight and Tyrion's own diminutive silhouette.
He did not move as Tyrion entered. His stance was perfectly controlled, a terrifying display of absolute discipline.
The silence in the room grew heavy, suffocating.
"Well," Tyrion began, clearing his throat and forcing a small, sharp smile to his lips.
"You are certainly as tall as the rumors suggested, though I must admit I expected more gold. My sister Cersei believes anyone of importance should be dripping in it." The Master Chief did not answer immediately. He slowly turned his massive head, his visor locking onto the dwarf. The sheer presence of the Spartan was a physical pressure in the small room.
"I am a soldier," Chief said.
His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the stone walls, completely devoid of emotion, yet carrying the weight of 100 campaigns.
"I don't have use for gold." A rare trait in Westeros, Tyrion said, stepping closer, his curiosity overriding his fear. He looked at the massive MA5D rifle slung across the chief's back.
"The small folk say you fell from the sky in a castle of iron. They say you wield the thunder.
My father always told me that men who command such power usually want a throne to put it on. We are survivors, Chief replied, his tone minimal, restrained. Our ship is damaged. We are securing our position. We have no interest in your thrones.
A comforting sentiment, Tyrion murmured, tilting his head. But intent matters very little when your presence alone destabilizes an entire continent.
You see, Lord Chief, if that is your name in King's Landing, power is a shadow on the wall. A trick, but your iron birds and your armored men are no trick.
If the lords of the south believe you're a threat to their power, they will try to kill you.
If they believe you can be used, they will try to buy you. What happens when they find out you cannot be bought?
They can try, Chief said simply. Inside Jon's neural lace, a soft blue light blinked.
The weapon's avatar materialized on the datapad, her expression intensely focused as she studied Tyrion's biological data and behavioral patterns.
Chief, the weapon's voice echoed in the Spartan's mind. His heart rate is elevated, but his cognitive functions are highly organized. He isn't reacting with superstition like the others. He's analyzing us. His culture is based entirely on feudal manipulation and court politics.
He's trying to figure out where we fit on their political ledger.
Ignore the ledger, Jon thought back. Focus on the threat.
I am, she said, her digital form glitching slightly as a wave of low-frequency static rippled through the ship's linked datapad.
But Chief, if this world destroys itself from the inside before the anomalies arrive, we won't have a perimeter to defend.
They're repeating the same mistakes humanity made before the Covenant.
They're fighting for dirt while the dark is closing in. Tyrion watched the subtle shift in the Spartan's posture, noticing the faint blue light reflecting off the green armor plates. You're speaking to someone, Tyrion observed, his eyes narrowing with intelligent fascination. The invisible lady the guards whisper about.
The one they call the spirit of the iron box.
Her name is the weapon, Chief said. She handles our intelligence. An invisible lady who handles intelligence, Tyrion sighed, taking a seat on a crude wooden bench. Fascinating. I usually have to pay my intelligence networks in gold and wine, and they still lie to me. If we survive this winter, you must tell me where one acquires such an assistant. South, far across the flooded plains of the Neck, and into the sun-drenched, rain-slicked towers of King's Landing, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of dread. Inside the small council chamber of the Red Keep, the air was heavy with the scent of damp wool and burning myrrh. Outside, a steady, rhythmic rain drummed against the leaded glass windows, casting long, weeping shadows across the dark oak council table. Cersei Lannister stood by the window, her silk gown the colour of fresh blood, her fingers white as she gripped a silver chalice. Her face was a mask of cold, regal control, but her green eyes flared with a fierce, defensive paranoia.
It is an absurdity, Cersei said, her voice sharp as broken glass as she turned to face the council.
A mountain of iron.
Armored giants who walk through storms.
Robert has listened to the drunken ramblings of northern peasants and called it a crisis. He has already spoken of riding north himself to see these monstrosities. I am afraid it is more than ramblings, Your Grace, Petter Baelish said softly. He sat at the end of the table, his hands folded neatly before him, a small, inscrutable smile playing on his lips. His sharp eyes gleamed with a dangerous, calculating light. My own birds have flown down from White Harbour. The traders speak of a thunder that shook the coast 3 weeks ago. A blue fire could be seen from the towers of the Twins, and the knights watch well. They have suddenly stopped asking for criminals and instead began unloading crates of a metal so hard it turns the edge of a castle-forged sword. Littlefinger leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper.
They call them the Unsk. They have no banners. They swear no fealty to the Iron Throne.
And their weapons, a smuggler from Eastwatch swore to me that a single one of their soldiers killed 10 wildlings without ever drawing a blade. Just a sound like a cracking whip, and the men dropped dead from 100 paces.
Cersei's jaw tightened. She didn't understand the science to her. It sounded like the dark sorcery of old Valyria, but she understood the language of power.
And this was a threat she could not control.
They're a threat to the boy, Cersei whispered later, in the privacy of her bedchamber, her hand resting on James' armoured shoulder. The Lord Commander of the Kingsguard stood by the door, his golden armour dull in the candlelight. If Robert rides north and aligns himself with these sky demons, the Lannister influencer cause is dead. Joffrey's inheritance will be nothing but ash. If they have weapons that can pierce steel from a mile away, what use is the Kingsguard? What use of the armours of the Rock?
We don't know what they are yet, Cersei, James said, his brow furrowed in genuine unease. He had fought 100 battles, but the reports from the north had unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. A soldier who cannot be killed by steel is not a soldier. It's a curse. Then we find their weakness, Cersei hissed, her face contorting with a cold, desperate malice. Every man has a throat. Every giant can be poisoned or deceived. If they threaten my son's throne, I will see their Iron Mountain buried in the snow.
Across the hall, in his own dark chamber, Petter Baelish sat alone, a single candle illuminating a map of the north. He didn't care about royal power or the survival of the Lannister line.
He cared about the ladder. and the arrival of the Infinity had just added 1,000 new rungs.
Chaos isn't a pit, Littlefinger murmured to the empty room, his fingers tracing the route of the King's Road toward Castle Black.
It's a storm. And the storm from the stars is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen.
In the solar of Winterfell, Eddard Stark sat alone, a pile of parchment letters spread before him under the dim light of an oil lamp.
The letters were from Jon and from Lord Commander Mormont.
They spoke of the dead walking the woods.
They spoke of the Master Chief.
Ned's hand trembled slightly as he read his son's words of a boy who had grown up too fast, speaking of a silent giant who fought with honor, but carried a weapon that belonged to no king.
Robert is coming, Ned whispered into the dark room, his heart heavy with an ominous certainty.
He comes with his court, his gold, and his arrogance.
He thinks this is a game,
a pageant to be won. Ned looked out the window toward the ancient weirwood tree in the Godswood.
Its red leaves were falling, a bleeding carpet against the white snow. He slowly began to realize that the world he knew, the world of honor, of vows, of ancient lineages, was being consumed by a catastrophic convergence. The North was no longer just the edge of the Seven Kingdoms.
It was the front line of a war for the survival of the living, and the living were too busy plotting to see the shadow on the snow.
Back at Castle Black, the mid-chapter horror arrived without warning. A heavy pressurized bell rang from the courtyard, followed by the frantic shouts of marines and the screams of horses. Chief was through the keep's door in a single, explosive motion, his boots shattering the ice on the threshold as he broke into the blinding blizzard of the yard.
A Night's Watch patrol had returned, but they had not come back alone.
3 rangers were collapsed in a sled, their limbs black with frostbite, their bodies shivering so violently that their teeth were snapping like twigs. Behind them, lashed to the timber frame of the sled, were 2 corpses, wildlings found in the drifts.
Get back! A marine sergeant shouted, his rifle raised, the tactical display on his helmet flashing red.
Step away from the bodies. Corporal, get the medical scanner up here now.
They are just dead men, you fool.
An old brother of the watch yelled, trying to push past the marine to reach his kin. They froze in the pass.
They aren't dead, Chief's voice boomed through the storm, instantly halting the crowd.
He walked down the stairs, his visor locked on the 2 wildling corpses. On his HUD, the weapons data was screaming.
Chief,
the biological signatures are anomalous. The internal body temperature is -60, but the muscle tissue is undergoing an intense, high-frequency kinetic contraction. The neurological paths are firing without a brain signal.
There, the corpse on the left jerked.
With a sickening wet crack, its frozen neck snapped to the side. The ropes binding its torso to the sled groaned, then shattered into frozen fibers as the dead man pulled himself upright. His eyes snapped open, 2 points of pure piercing electric blue that seemed to suck the light from the surrounding torches. Panic exploded. The Night's Watch brothers shrieked, falling over one another as they scrambled backward into the slush. The undead wildling lunged, its jaw snapping. With a mindless predatory hunger, its blue eyes locked onto the nearest marine.
Bang! The Master Chief's magnum backed once a deafening blast that echoed off the wall like a cannon shot.
The high-explosive 12.7 mm round struck the corpse directly in the center of its skull.
The impact was catastrophic. The head exploded in a shower of black, crystallized bone and frozen tissue. The headless body fell back onto the sled, twitching violently for 3 seconds before finally going still. The courtyard was dead silent, save for the howling of the wind and the hiss of the smoking pistol in Jon's hand. The Black brothers stared at the headless corpse, then up at the giant in green iron, their breath caught in their throats. They had seen men killed before, but they had never seen death delivered with such clinical, terrifying precision. Tyrion Lannister stood at the edge of the lean-to, his face completely devoid of colour, his silver flask forgotten in his hand.
He looked at the smoking weapon in the Spartan's hand, then at the black fluid freezing on the snow.
They don't stay down, Chief said, turning his visor toward Tyrion. His voice was flat, an objective statement of fact. And your walls went holden.
An hour later, the storm eased slightly, leaving the world in a state of frozen suspense.
Tyrion Lannister stood on the wooden platform of the winch gauge, looking out through the iron bars at the vast, dark sea of the haunted forest stretching north into infinity.
The cold wind bit at his nose, but his mind was burning with a terrible, magnificent realization. The old world was dead. The lions, the wolves, the stags, they were all just children playing with wooden swords in the path of an oncoming avalanche. High above him, on the highest precipice of the wall, the Master Chief stood like a sentinel of ancient stone, his silhouette black against the grey sky. Beside him, the weapon's blue light flickered within his helmet, her sensors tracking a massive coordinated energy pulse moving deep beneath the polar ice caps.
Far beyond the dark tree line, the White Walkers watched the wall.
They did not attack.
They did not retreat. They were learning. They were studying the shape of the new iron that had fallen from the stars, preparing their frost for a war that would decide if the world would see another dawn.
Humanity remained divided by gold, by thrones, and by ancient slights, but the winter had already crossed the border.
And as the dark deepened, the green giant stood upon the ice, the last shield of a world that did not even know it was already doomed.
Chapter 05 Fire across the SEA. The sun died over the Dothraki Sea in a long, bleeding smear of crimson and bruised violet. Across the endless, rolling plains of Essos, the wind moved through the tall, dry grass like a heavy sigh, causing the amber stalks to ripple in a vast, undulating wave that stretched to the edge of the world. It was a landscape of dust, leather, and ancient nomadic rhythm. In the twilight, the campfires of Khal Drogo's Karlasar began to prick the gathering dark, their orange embers crackling beneath a sky that felt immense, lonely, and entirely indifferent to the plights of men. The warm desert air, thick with the scent of roasted horseflesh, sour milk, and sweat, carried the distant, sharp calls of horse lords returning from the day's ride.
Daenerys Targaryen stood alone at the edge of the camp, her silver-gold hair stirred by the hot evening breeze.
Her silk tunic was thin, yet she felt a deeper, older chill settling into her bones, a phantom sensation that had nothing to do with the warm sands beneath her boots.
In her hands, she cradled the dark, petrified green dragon egg that Magister Illyrio had gifted her. The scales were cold stone, yet tonight they felt different.
Beneath the hard, ancient shell, there was a faint, rhythmic thrumming, an unnatural vibration that felt like a tiny, distant heart trying to beat in sync with a sound she could not hear.
As she stared at it, the deep green ridges seemed to catch the dying sunlight,
glowing with faint, iridescent veins of gold that pulsed like cooling magma.
Khaleesi, a quiet, rumbling voice broke her reverie.
Sir Jorah Mormont stepped out from the tall grass, his heavy broadsword slung across his back, his leather brigandine stained with dust.
His weathered face was grim, his grey eyes fixed on the horizon, toward the sunset that pointed the way back to the Westeros he had been cast out from.
The traders from Cath arrived with the evening caravan, Jorah said, his voice tightly restrained.
They bring strange tidings from the port at Selvary's, tales that had set the entire harbour talking. Daenerys did not turn her eyes from the egg.
More stories of the falling star, Jorah.
More than stories now, Khaleesi, Jorah replied, stepping closer, his military instincts apparent in the cautious, analytical cadence of his speech. The sailors swear that a mountain of black iron did not merely fall beyond the wall, it buried itself in the ice. They speak of a fortress 3 miles long, adorned with lights that burn brighter than the sun, and iron birds that fly through blizzards without wings.
They call the men who command it Donsk.
Armored giants who carry rods of iron that strike with the force of a thunderbolt.
Daenerys felt a strange electric shiver ripple across her skin. She looked up, her violet eyes serious, catching the light of the first stars.
An iron mountain from the heavens. Do the priests say it is a sign from the gods? The red priests in Volantes are chanting in the streets, Jorah said, his jaw tightening with an old soldier's pragmatism. They claim Aor has cast down his shield to aid the living against the darkness in the north.
But I know Westerosi warfare, Khaleesi. I fought on the Trident.
I saw what King Robert's warhammers can do to a line of knights.
If these travellers speak even a fraction of the truth, if there is a force in the north that possesses weapons that can shatter a castle wall from miles away without a single catapult, then kingdoms will not merely fall. They will vanish overnight.
The armies of the 7 kingdoms are nothing but flesh and steel. Against an iron mountain, they are nothing but sheep for the slaughter.
He looked down at his own leather-wrapped hands, a deep brooding paranoia shadowing his brow.
And there are other whispers, Daenerys. Whispers that the dead are walking the northern forests.
If the old legends are waking alongside this iron beast, then humanity is caught between 2 entirely different eras of war. One of ice and one of fire we have never known. Daenerys touched the glowing vein on the dragon egg, her fingers lingering on the stone scales.
She could feel the heat rising within it, an ancient, volatile energy that seemed to be accelerating, drawn toward the northern horizon like iron to a lodestone.
It matters, Jorah, she whispered, her voice carrying a prophetic weight that made the night look at her with sudden unease. The star did not fall by chance.
It came because the world is waking up, thousands of miles to the northwest, across the grey, turbulent expanse of the shivering sea. The world had dissolved into an absolute, white fury.
A brutal northern storm slammed into the Frostfang Mountains, burying the valley under 3 feet of fresh ice. At the center of the white abyss, the Unsk Infinity lay like a broken leviathan, its heavy titanium bulkheads groaning as the shifting glaciers pressed against its flanks.
Inside the secondary engineering bay, the air was a freezing mist, lit only by the flickering blue hollows of diagnostic terminals and the harsh orange flare of plasma torches wielded by exhausted technicians. Captain Thomas Lasky stood on a metal catwalk, his hands gripped tightly onto the freezing railing. Below him, the primary fusion reactor core hummed with an uneven, guttural vibration that made the deck plates chatter beneath his boots. "We've rationed the emergency power to 40% on the lower decks, Captain," Commander Palmer reported, her armor caked with frost as she stepped up beside him. Her helmet was slung over her arm, her face pale from sheer exhaustion. But the cooling lines are freezing over faster than the engineers can flush them.
The local environment isn't just cold, sir. It's drawing thermal energy directly out of our systems.
It's like the valley itself is an energy sink pulling the heat out of our reactors to feed something else.
Lasky wiped a layer of frost from his brow, his expression heavy with the immense burden of command.
Any update on the supply estimates?
We've got 3 weeks of standard military rations left if we cut the Marines to 2 meals a day, Palmer said bluntly. Ammunition is down to 60% for standard kinetic rounds.
We can't manufacture more propellant without the secondary refineries online, and those are buried under 10,000 tons of ice.
If we get into another engagement like the one the chief reported at the Wildwing village, we're going to run dry, Captain. We're highly trained, we've got the tech, but we are isolated.
Completely. No Unsk fleet is coming through that rift. Lasky looked down at the flickering blue hologram of the ship's internal layout, while multiple decks flashed with red system failure runes. He knew the truth. They weren't just a stranded ship anymore. They were an island of futuristic survival in an ocean of primitive, brutal history.
We hold the line, Sarah, he said softly, his voice carrying a quiet, human determination.
The Infinity is the last fortress humanity has in this world. If we go dark, whatever is waking up out there in the snow takes everything. In the cold, dark undercroft of Castle Black, the Master Chief stood perfectly still beneath the flickering glow of a portable Unsk scanner array. Before him, laid out upon a crude timber table, was Longclaw, the ancestral Valyrian steel bastard sword of House Mormont, which the Lord Commander had offered for technical analysis. The dark, rippled steel of the blade folded 1,000 times in the smoking fires of old Valyria seemed to drink the harsh white light of the scanner, its smoke-like patterns shifting like liquid ink under the electronic beams. John 117 moved his massive, olive-drab gauntlet over the hilt.
He had studied weapons across 100 different star systems, Covenant plasma rifles, banished gravity hammers, Forerunner hard light suppressors, but this piece of primitive steel felt entirely anomalous.
His tactical HUD was flashing with a series of erratic, non-standard readings that made his crosshairs jump.
It's impossible, Chief, the weapon's voice echoed in his mind, her blue avatar materializing on the edge of his visor display, her brow furrowed in deep academic frustration.
I'm running a full molecular resonance
Scan on the blade. The carbon-ion matrix isn't just dense, it's locked in a state of permanent quantum synchronization.
The material structure is actively absorbing the ambient electromagnetic interference from the wall, converting it into a low-frequency thermal barrier along the edge.
Is it a weapon?
Chief asked mentally. Yes, but the science behind it is its old, Chief, she whispered, her image flickering as a sudden tremor from the ship's distant reactor shook the stone walls.
It's not manufacturing tech.
It's an energy science we've never encountered. The molecular pattern matches the same harmonic resonance I detected in the dragon eggs from the Eastern traders' reports, and the ancient weirwood roots beneath the snow. This Valyrian steel isn't just metal.
It's an isotopic conductor for a form of negative energy this world calls magic.
She leaned closer to the scanner readout, her digital eyes wide with a growing, unsettling realization.
Chief, the reason our kinetic bullets didn't stop that entity in the woods is because its cellular structure is animated by that exact same negative energy field. Our bullets pass through the tissue, but they don't disrupt the conductor.
But the steel, if it strikes the entity, the quantum synchronization will create a massive thermal discharge.
It will shatter the conductor. It will kill them.
John reached down and closed his massive armored fingers around the hilt of Longclaw.
The sword felt remarkably light, balanced with a lethal perfection that reminded him of the energy swords wielded by elite zealots.
It was a primitive weapon, born of blood and superstition, yet it possessed a molecular defense capability that modern Unsk science could not replicate.
Then we need more of it, she said flatly.
We can't, the weapon said, her voice dropping into a tense hushed pitch.
The records Samuel found say the art of forging it was lost when their old empire collapsed in fire.
There are only a few hundred blades left in the entire continent, held by noble families who would rather die than part with them. Jon Snow stood in the doorway of the vault, his black cloak dusted with snow, his hand resting on the stone archway as he watched the giant study his house's blade. He had seen the chief kill the undead wildling with a single shot from his ironside arm, but seeing the Spartan hold a sword of Valyrian steel filled him with a strange, solemn awe. It belongs to the north, Jon said quietly, stepping into the dim room. My father says a man who wields Valyrian steel carries the weight of every ancestor who died protecting the realm. It's not just a tool for killing, Chief. It's a vow. Chief turned his golden visor toward the bastard of Winterfell.
A vow doesn't stop an army, Snow. Weapons do.
Sometimes they're the same thing, Jon replied, his purple-grey eyes steady as he looked up at the green titanium giant.
The Night's Watch took a vow to be the shield that guards the realms of men.
We don't have your iron birds or your glowing shields, but we know how to die standing.
If your people don't learn how to stand with us, your Iron Mountain will just be another tomb in the snow.
John 117 looked down at the rippled steel of the sword, then back at the boy.
He recognized the look in John's eyes. It was the same look he had seen in the eyes of countless Marine recruits before a drop into hostile territory. It was the look of a soldier who knew the odds were impossible, but who refused to take a step back.
"We'll stand," Chief said simply.
"But we fight to win."
The horror returned to the north 3 hours before the dawn, not with a roar, but with a sudden, absolute loss of sound. A remote, unscotomated sensor station, positioned 5 kilometers deep within the haunted forest to track the oncoming blue anomalies, suddenly went dark on the Infinity's main tactical grid.
No distress signal was sent.
No telemetry error was logged.
The icon simply vanished from the screen like a light extinguished beneath a glass. Master Chief led an investigation team, 4 Spartans from Fighting Shadow and 2 Night's Watch scouts into the pitch-black heart of the woods. The blizzard had ceased, leaving the forest in a state of frozen, unnatural silence that made the crunch of their boots sound like snapping bones. The fog was thick, a white soup that clung to the black, skeletal branches of the ancient pines, obscuring the sky completely. When they reached the coordinates of the sensor station, the scene that met John's visor was one of clinical, terrifying consumption. The portable UNSC sensor dish, a heavy, titanium-framed unit powered by an auxiliary hydrogen cell, stood completely intact at the center of a small clearing.
It hadn't been blasted by plasma or crushed by gravity hammer,
but it was covered in a thick, translucent layer of blue ice that had crystallized the delicate internal circuitry, freezing the humming generator solid. The 2 automated M2020 turrets that had been set to defend the perimeter were still aimed out into the darkness, their barrels cleared, their ammunition feeds full. They hadn't fired a single round.
Chief Spartan Tanaka whispered, her rifle raised as she scanned the perimeter. "Look at the snow. There are no tracks.
No footprints.
Nothing."
John knelt beside the generator. The snow around the station was pristine white and untouched.
But there was blood.
A single dark track of human blood had been spilled across the ice, but it had been frozen so quickly that it had formed a smooth, dark glass before it could even soak into the drifts.
The 2 Marines who had been stationed to guard the dish were gone.
Their weapons were left behind, lying in the snow, their iron frames frosted over.
There were no signs of a struggle. No broken branches. No discarded gear.
They didn't fight. John observed, his tactical optics scanning the dark tree line.
Something bypassed the turrets before the automated systems could track them.
"Worse than that, Chief." The weapon's voice cracked inside his helmet, her transmission suddenly laced with a sharp, piercing burst of static that made him wince.
The medical sensors in their arm line picking up their ghost signals.
"They aren't dead."
Their life support telemetry is still broadcasting from somewhere deep within the forest, but the coordinates are shifting constantly, moving faster than any human can run through a blizzard.
Suddenly, the Night's Watch scout beside Jon Snow let out a low, whimpering cry.
He pointed a shaking, leather-wrapped finger up into the black canopy of the trees above them.
John raised his rifle, the tactical light cutting through the thick white fog.
High above, hanging from the branches of an ancient, rotting pine, were the frozen corpses of the missing Marines.
Their grey UNSC armor had been stripped away, leaving their pale flesh exposed to the biting cold.
Their bodies had been mutilated,
their torsos hollowed out and arranged in a precise, vertical spiral that twisted around the trunk of the tree like a serpent.
And then their eyes opened.
2 points of piercing, electric blue light stared down at the Master Chief through the white mist.
They did not move. They did not drop from the branches to attack.
They simply hung there in the frozen silence, a direct, intelligent warning left by a predator that was no longer hiding.
"They are watching us," Tanaka muttered, her hand trembling slightly on her rifle grip.
"They are learning our search patterns, Chief."
"Fall back," John commanded, his voice a low, hard rumble that tolerated no delay.
"Back to the perimeter.
Now."
As the squad retreated into the fog, the temperature behind them dropped 20 degrees in an instant, a silent, ancient wave of frost that chased them through the trees like a living thing. The White Walkers were no longer just a myth or a biological anomaly. They were an intelligent, adapting army that was closing its grip around the neck of Castle Black. Far to the south, beneath the warm, star-filled sky of Essos, Daenerys Targaryen sat by her campfire, the dark green dragon egg resting in her lap. The Dothraki camp had gone quiet, the only sounds the distant stamping of horses and the low snore of the guards.
She held her palms against the stone shell, and tonight she didn't just feel warmth.
She felt a sharp, violent surge of energy spike through the stone, a sudden electric current that made her gasp, her violet eyes widening in the dark. Beneath the petrified scales, the glowing gold veins pulsed with a sudden, furious light, casting a pale, magical aura across her silver hair. In that moment, across the thousands of miles of ocean, she felt a profound, inexplicable connection to the frozen north, a vision of a towering green giant standing upon a wall of ice, his golden face turned toward an oncoming storm of dead stars. "The fire is coming," she whispered into the desert night, her heart hammering against her ribs as the egg hummed with a terrifying new life. Deep beneath the glaciers of the Frostfang Mountains, the primary fusion reactor of the Infinity shuddered, sending a massive tremor through the earth that shook the ice cliffs to their foundations. The arrival of the starship had not merely brought steel to Westeros, it had acted as a catalyst, an immense technological surge that was accelerating the awakening of ancient, primordial forces across the world. The destinies of two entirely different eras were beginning to collide in the dark. The White Walkers were moving, the dragons were stirring, and as the Master Chief stood upon the 700-foot barrier of ice, his rifle aimed into the white fury of the storm, he knew the line would soon be tested. The winter was no longer a shadow on the wall. It was a war for the soul of the living, and the first battle was already knocking at the gate. Chapter 06. The dead in the snow. The hurricane force winds did not merely blow past the wall, they slammed into the jagged ice precipice, shrieking like 1,000 dying beasts.
At the base of the 700-foot barrier, Castle Black was entirely swallowed by white darkness.
The brutal northern blizzard reduced the high-intensity halogen floodlights to faint, ghostly amber smears that barely cut through the driving snow.
On the ground, the courtyard had become a claustrophobic maze of frozen mud, rotting timber, and rigid titanium fortifications. Marines from the 10th Shock Troops, their heavy charcoal-grey chest plates caked in layers of blue-tinted frost, laboured alongside shivering brothers of the Night's Watch to reinforce the southern defensive perimeter. They dragged heavy sandbags and interlocking metal barricades into place, their gloved hands freezing to the steel frames within seconds. The air was so violently cold it drew blood from exposed nostrils and caused the breath inside the Marines' helmets to freeze into thin sheets of ice against their visors. Nearby, 2 Pelican dropships sat completely grounded, their massive thrusters choked with ice, their primary flight systems deactivated to preserve what little auxiliary fuel remained. Every few minutes, a deep, rhythmic tremor vibrated through the frozen earth, the distant, metallic groan of the damaged Infinity miles away in the Frostfangs, its superstructure settling under the crushing weight of the shifting glaciers. Inside the Sally Port, Commander Sarah Palmer stood over a sputtering portable terminal, her armored gauntlets clenched into white-knuckled fists. The tactical map of the perimeter was a mess of jumping static. The automated sensor grids were flashing red, their telemetry data completely corrupted by the mounting electromagnetic interference seeping from the surrounding forest.
"I don't care about your ancient customs, Lord Commander." Palmer's voice cut through the howling wind, sharp and aggressive with sleep-deprived tension.
She turned her hard glare upon Joel Mormont, who stood wrapped in ice-crusted bare furs near the timber archway. "Your men are praying to trees while my automated turrets are freezing solid in their housings. If those sensor arrays stay dark, we won't have 3 seconds of warning before whatever is out there reaches the gate. And my men have held this wall for thousands of years without your iron toys, Commander." Mormont rumbled back, his weathered face carved with deep lines of exhaustion. His iron broadsword creaked against his belt as he stepped into the light of a flickering fusion lantern. "Your machines make a great deal of noise, but they cannot smell the wild. The air has turned to glass. The horses are screaming in their stalls. The old gods are telling us to lock the gates and pray we see the dawn."
"The ONSC doesn't rely on prayer for perimeter security," Palmer hissed, turning back to her tactical pad as it let out a sharp, digital whine.
"We're running out of batteries for the automated M2020 turret. Our auxiliary reactor power is fluctuating across all command decks, and my Spartans are conducting patrol rotations in conditions that would freeze a standard hydraulic suit solid. If Castle Black falls, your 7 kingdoms won't even have time to scream." 100 feet away, near the heavy oak timbers of the Wormwalk, the Master Chief stood entirely motionless. He was a silent monument of scarred olive-drab titanium, completely indifferent to the storm that tried to tear his massive frame from the stone foundation. His golden visor was fixed on the pitch-black tree line of the haunted forest beyond the wall. On his internal heads-up display, the motion tracker was completely blank, yet it wasn't quiet. The interface was jumping with anomalous low-frequency spikes that shouldn't exist. "Chief," the weapon's voice whispered directly into his auditory cortex, her blue avatar materializing on his peripheral display. Her usual bright, calculating expression was gone, replaced by a tight, hollow look of deep digital distress. "The interference patterns are getting worse. It's not standard radio jamming. The cold zones outside the perimeter are actively disrupting the base-level circuitry of our long-range sensors. The telemetry data isn't missing, it's being overwritten." "Explain." John 117 responded, his deep, gravely baritone perfectly calm, perfectly disciplined. "I'm picking up audio artifacts inside the corrupted radio frequencies," she said, her digital hands trembling slightly as she processed trillions of lines of distorted code. "It's not static, Chief. It's a voice. Or thousands of voices. They are hidden inside the white noise humming at a subvocal frequency."
"I can't translate the dialect." But the mathematics behind the signal structure are older than human civilization. They aren't trying to jam us.
They're probing our network architecture. They are learning how our comms function.
John didn't reply.
He adjusted his grip on his MA-5D rifle, his tactical optics zooming in on the dark canopy of the woods. He had fought the Covenant, the Banished, and the Flood, enemies that used overwhelming force, fanatical zeal, or viral consumption. But this enemy felt different.
The White Walkers weren't mindless monsters driven by hunger.
They were patient. They were analytical.
Every patrol they had intercepted, every sensor station they had frozen, had been an intentional test of humanity's capability.
They were strategists probing the line, measuring the exact strength of the new steel that had fallen from the stars.
Beside his boot, a sudden low growl cut through the mechanical hum of his armor.
Ghost Jon Snow's massive white direwolf stood rigid in the snow.
His matted fur was white as the blizzard, his red eyes burning with a primal, intelligent focus that caught the light of the floodlights.
He wasn't looking at the forest, he was staring down at the deep drifts of snow directly outside the western wall, his teeth bared, a low, wet rumble vibrating through his chest.
He senses them, Jon Snow said, stepping out from the shadow of the armory keep, his black cloak wrapped tight around his shoulders.
He held his ancestral Valyrian steel blade Longclaw low at his side, its dark, rippled surface catching the faint blue glow of the Spartans' tactical displays.
An animal knows when the dead are near long before your machines can give you a green light, Chief.
Jon looked down at the wolf, then back at the bastard of Winterfell. Over the past days of training and defensive preparation, a quiet, unstated respect had formed between the Spartan and the young ranger.
Jon Snow did not possess advanced weapons or kinetic shields, but he possessed the quiet, unyielding resolve of a soldier who had already accepted his own death to hold the line.
Your wolf has a better sense of profile than our tactical network, Chief said, his visor tilting toward Jon. Keep him close to the western Sally Port. If the line breaks there, the courtyard is compromised. He won't leave my side, Jon said, his gaze drifting to the silent forest. My brother Sam has been down in the vaults all night with your little blue lady. He says he found something in the old scrolls.
Something that matches what your ship is recording.
Deep within the subterranean vaults of Castle Black, beneath 3 layers of ancient stone, where the wind could only be heard as a distant, hollow moan, Samwell Tarly sat huddled over a pile of crumbling parchment.
The small chamber smelled of damp earth, rotting calfskin, and the sharp chemical odor of a portable, unscrewed data pad.
A single tallow candle flickered on the edge of the timber table, its light reflecting across the pale, sweat-streaked face of the young acolyte.
Above the data pad, a weapon's miniature blue form floated, her face illuminated by rows of glowing analysis streams that she was cross-referencing with the ancient text Sam translated.
Look here, my lady, Sam whispered, his voice shaking as his ink-stained fingers traced a passage written in the faded, scratchy hand of a long-dead Grandmeister.
This scroll was hidden in a sealed iron bin beneath the water cisterns.
It talks of the great winter during the Age of Heroes.
It says when the cold shadows walk, they do not bring the winter comes with them, born of a broken star that wept blood upon the snow.
Sam looked up at her, his eyes wide with a profound existential terror.
The old stories always said the White Walkers could command their ice, but this text suggests they become stronger faster whenever there is an unnatural disturbance in the firmament, a celestial event.
The weapon's digital form glitched violently, a ripple of white noise tearing through her blue silhouette as she processed the translation. Somewhere in the infinity, tumbled out of that slipspace rupture, we tore a localized hole in the dimensional boundary of this system.
We vented gigawatts of exotic radiation and plasma fire into the upper atmosphere. Our ship's main fusion
reactor is still bleeding an immense, high-frequency energy signature into the planet's magnetic core.
She turned around, her digital eyes flashing with an overwhelming realization that made her image tremble.
We didn't just crash here, Sam. The energy from our ship's drive, it's acting like a massive power grid for the negative energy field that animates the dead.
We're accelerating their awakening. The arrival of our technology has given them the exact catalyst they needed to break the dampening field of the wall. Before Sam could even draw a breath to respond, the candle on the table died. It did not blow out from a draft, the flames simply withered into nothing, the wick turning to a brittle grey ash in an instant. The air inside the stone vault dropped 30 degrees in a single heartbeat, the moisture on Sam's lips turning to painful ice. From the dark corridor outside the vault, a low, wet scratching sound echoed through the stone walls, the sound of heavy, uncoordinated footsteps dragging across the ancient flagstones.
In the courtyard above, the mid-chapter horror arrived with a sudden, devastating silence.
The low hum of the portable fusion generators died away as the secondary power grid suffered a catastrophic short-circuit.
The floodlights blew out in a simultaneous explosion of glass and white sparks, plunging Castle Black into a total, suffocating darkness broken only by the dim, orange glow of the dying watchfires. Then the horns blew. It was the Night's Watch horn, but it didn't stop at one blast.
What whom?
It blew 3 long, terrifying times, a sound that had not been heard at the wall in 8,000 years.
Dallas.
Perimeter breach. Harmer's voice screamed over the tide beam radio, distorted by an immense layer of static.
Western Gate. They are coming out of the drifts. Through the driving white wall of the blizzard, they appeared. They did not sprint, they moved with a silent, relentless momentum, hundreds of frozen corpses emerging from the white dark like ghosts born of the snow. There were wildlings with their throats torn out, ancient rangers whose flesh had rotted to the bone, and mountain beasts whose eyes burned with that same piercing electric blue fire.
They did not scream or shout. The only sound was the sickening clack 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 of frozen joints popping and bones sliding against ice as they threw themselves against the titanium barricades.
Open fire, the Marine Sergeant yelled.
The western wall exploded into a chaotic, deafening wall of sound. The Marines unleashed a torrent of 7.62 MN tracer rounds, their red lines of fire cutting through the blinding white storm like lasers.
Supersonic bullets tore through the oncoming horde, shattering frozen skulls, ripping limbs from shoulders, and splitting torsos to ribbons. Beside them, Night's Watch archers loosed a volley of flaming arrows, their orange arcs lighting up the sky before burying themselves in the dead flesh. But the firepower was a hollow victory. A corpse whose lower jaw had been completely blown away by a Marine's rifle continued to climb the titanium fence, its bony fingers gripping the metal without fear. Another took 3 heavy rounds to the chest, falling backward into the slush, only for its joints to snap back into position a second later as it pulled itself back to its feet. They did not have morale. They did not have fear. They were an army of pure, unadulterated consumption, and the kinetic force of the Unsk weapons was merely slowing them down. High above the melee, a single Pelican dropship managed to fire up its auxiliary spotlight, its powerful beam cutting a white tunnel through the blizzard.
The light settled on the center of the western approach, and the world went dead silent.
The wind stopped howling. The driving snow seemed to freeze in mid-air, falling in slow, heavy flakes around the figure that stepped out from the white fog.
It was a White Walker.
It moved with a mythic, elegant grace that belonged to an ancient king, its milk-white skin stretched tight over a skeletal frame that seemed carved from ice. Its armor was a matrix of shifting crystalline plates that reflected the blue light of its own burning eyes. In its right hand, it swung a long, translucent blade of frost that hummed with a terrifying, sub-zero resonance. As it walked, the pools of melted slush around its boots froze solid in an instant, the intense, unnatural cold spreading outward from its steps like a physical wall. The Pelican spotlight flickered and died as the entity drew near, its electronic systems fried by the sheer intensity of the sub-zero energy sink. The Master Chief did not wait for an order. He vaulted over the sandbag barricade, his heavy engineer boots hitting the frozen ground with a dull thud as he charged through the sea of twitching corpses. He dropped his rifle, letting it hang on its sling, and drew Longclaw from his belt, the Valyrian steel blade humming with a strange, synchronized blue light as it met the freezing air. The White Walker turned its star-blue eyes upon the green giant, its expression one of cold, calculating intelligence. It raised its frost blade, and the 2 warriors collided in the center of the clearing. Boom! The collision was cataclysmic. The translucent frost blade struck the edge of the Valyrian steel sword, and a violent explosion of blue sparks and white ice erupted between them. The sheer kinetic shock of the blow registered a red spike across John's shield meter, the immense cold instantly draining 30% of his armor's power reserves as the energy shields fought to purge the frost. John swung a heavy, armored fist aimed at the creature's skull, but the White Walker ducked beneath the blow with an impossible, liquid speed, its blade sliding along John's chest plate in a shower of brilliant, blue sparks. The Spartan spun, his enhanced reflexes taking over as he drove the tip of Longclaw forward in a surgical thrust.
The Valyrian steel blade pierced the creature's crystalline shoulder armor.
The reaction was instantaneous. The moment the synchronized carbon matrix of the Valyrian steel met the negative energy of the creature's flesh, a high-frequency thermal discharge tore through the wound. The White Walker did not bleed. Instead, its crystalline armor began to crack with a high-pitched, shattering sound like glass breaking under a hammer. A pale white mist vented from the wound, its blue eyes flaring with a sudden, transient shock of genuine pain. The creature leaped backward 5 meters, disappearing into the thick white fog before John could deliver a follow-up strike. It did not return to the fight. It stood on the high ridge above the clearing, its hand resting on its cracked shoulder, its star-blue eyes studying the Master Chief with a quite terrifying focus. It had seen enough. It had tested the Spartan steel. It had measured the strength of their shields. With a low, grinding sound that sounded like glaciers sliding into the sea, the White Walker signaled a retreat. The remaining horde of the dead instantly turned, melting back into the white dark of the blizzard as quickly as they had emerged, leaving Castle Black in a state of shattered, hollow silence. 2 hours later, the dawn arrived, though it brought no light, only a dull, iron grey that illuminated the true cost of the night.
In the courtyard, large piles of broken, headless corpses were being dragged into heaps by exhausted Marines and Black brothers, their bodies slick with a black, tar-like fluid that froze on the stones.
The automated defense systems across Castle Black were dark, their batteries dead, their circuits fried by the supernatural chill of the encounter. The morale of the Night's Watch had collapsed entirely.
Men sat in the slush, their heads in their hands, weeping silently or staring into the grey sky with vacant, broken eyes.
They had seen the dead rise, they had seen that their steel meant nothing against the winter. Master Chief stood at the base of the wall, his green, titanium armor covered in a thick mantle of blue frost that his suit's regulators were struggling to purge.
His energy shield meter was flashing yellow, a constant reminder of how close the line had come to breaking.
Jon Snow walked up beside him, his face pale, his black cloak stained with the black fluid of the dead.
He looked at Longclaw, which Jon had returned to his belt. The blade was clean, but the rippled steel seemed darker now, as if it had drunk the cold of the creature's blood.
"We held," Jon said, his voice a low, heavy rasp.
"But they'll come back. They know what we have now."
Beside them, the weapon's blue form appeared on a portable terminal, her face completely devoid of colour as she reviewed the final tactical diagnostic from the engagement. It wasn't a full assault, Jon.
It was a reconnaissance mission.
They wanted to see how our weapons functioned. They wanted to measure our shields. She looked up at the Master Chief, her voice laced with a profound, terrifying certainty.
"The enemy is learning us, Chief.
They know we have ammunition limitations.
They know our electronics fail in the cold.
And they're adapting faster than we can repair our systems." John 117 did not answer.
He turned his golden visor toward the north, where the vast, dark sea of the haunted forest stood silent beneath the iron sky. Ghost stood at the edge of the timber perimeter, his red eyes fixed on the distant ridges where the blue lights of the Winter Kings were waiting for the fires of the Infinity to finally die. Something ancient and terrible had awakened completely beneath the ice, and as the Spartan stood upon the frozen ground, his hand resting on his rifle, he knew the war had only just begun.
The dead did not fear their fire, and the winter was no longer just a storm. It was a shadow that was closing its fingers around the throat of the world.
Chapter 07. The long night signaled the stench of burned dead, flesh hung thick in the freezing air, a heavy, greasy smoke that refused to lift from the slush of Castle Black. Beneath the steady, relentless fall of fresh snow, the piles of undead bodies still smouldered, their frozen marrow weeping black fluid that hissed against the red-stained flagstones. The titanium barricades along the western perimeter stood buckled and bent, half buried under walls of ice thrown up during the night's fury. Marines from the 10th Shock Troops, their eyes bloodshot and dark with sleep deprivation, moved with leaden steps through the ruins. They manually collected spent 7.62 mm casings from the drifts, their frozen armor creaking loudly against the sub-zero wind. Each piece of brass was weighed like gold.
Their ammunition reserves had dwindled to a critical margin, a reality that hung over the command hierarchy like a death sentence.
In the makeshift medical stations inside the timber keeps, the air was a suffocating mix of copper, damp wool, and the low, agonizing moans of wounded Night's Watch brothers. Exhausted Navy corpsmen worked under the sputtering light of portable fusion lanterns treating frostbite that had turned flesh into black glass alongside wounds inflicted by weapons of solid ice. Outside, a lone Spartan Roman force stood sentinel upon the lower parapet, a towering, motionless silhouette of caked frost and cold iron, his visor reflecting the iron-grey emptiness of the northern horizon.
The Pelican dropships sat like wounded beasts beneath canvas tops, their cockpits iced over, completely grounded by the hurricane-force winds that still rattled the ancient wooden towers of the castle.
"They brought this upon us," muttered a voice from the shadows of the common hall. A group of black-clad recruits huddled around a dime-peat fire, their faces pale and hollowed by fear.
They stared out at a passing Marine patrol with undisguised malice.
The war held for thousands of years. Then their iron castle falls from the stars, their blue fires light up the sky, and the dead come knocking at our gate 3 hours later.
"It's a curse. They've angered the old gods."
Commander Sarah Palmer caught the look as she strode through the courtyard, her engineer armor panels bearing deep, silvery gouges from the previous night's engagement. Her jaw was clamped tight, her tongue hard as she bypassed the men to meet Captain Lasky beneath a canvas command lean-to. "Morale is bottoming out, Captain," Palmer said, her voice dropping into a tense, controlled register over the low hum of a portable generator. "The Black Brothers are starting to look at us like we're the enemy.
If we don't establish a hard military curfew and seize control of the rationing lines, the space is going to fracture from the inside. We're down to 40 rounds per man for the primary rifles.
If they hit us like that again, we're down to sidearms and knives." Lasky did not look up immediately from the tactical table, where a single flickering hologram of the Infinity showed the flagship's primary reactor core pulsing with an unstable, erratic rhythm.
His uniform was rumpled, his eyes shadowed by an immense, soul-crushing weariness. "We can't rule this castle by force, Sarah. We are guests of a dying order, and we need their rangers if we're going to understand the terrain.
If we lose the watch, we lose our eyes.
He looked out at the courtyard, where the snow was already beginning to bury the black stains of the battle.
We aren't just fighting a siege commander. We're fighting a clock. And the clock is running faster than our reactors can handle. The Master Chief walked the length of the northern battlements alone. His massive olive-drab gauntlet brushed against the rough stone, tracking the subtle, rhythmic vibrations that had begun to thrum deep within the ice of the wall itself.
His tactical HUD was a sea of shifting parameters.
The motion tracker was still blind, jumping with white noise, but John 117 didn't need electronics to see the truth. He had spent decades studying the battlefields of the outer colonies. He knew when an enemy was retreating, and he knew when an enemy was conducting a combat assessment.
The White Walkers had not come to destroy Castle Black during the storm. They had come to probe it.
They had measured the muzzle velocity of the rifles, the refresh rate of his energy shields, and the exact distance their undead could advance before the automated turrets opened fire. They were military minds, patient, analytical, and completely devoid of the emotional errors that governed human warfare.
They were adjusting this strategy to match the shape of the Unsk steel.
Chief, the weapon's voice cut into his neural lace, her tone unusually small, stripped of all its baseline optimism.
Her blue avatar materialized on his peripheral display, her digital hands wrapped tightly around herself. I've isolated the background interference that's been jamming our comms.
It's not static.
I found a signal pattern.
Source, Chief asked mentally, his eyes scanning the dark, silent edge of the haunted forest below.
It's coming from inside the wall, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly.
Deep down beneath the foundation stones where the ice meets the bedrock,
there is an active low-frequency electromagnetic pulse repeating every 84 seconds. I've been running away from analysis on it for 3 hours. It's a transmission, John.
A broadcast.
To where?
North, the weapon said, her image flickering as a sudden spike of white noise rippled through the suit's internal channels. Every time the pulse hits, a corresponding energy bloom registers along the northern polar shelf. But it's not human, and it's not Forerunner. There are voices hidden inside the signal, Chief. They sound like grinding shards of ice repeating the same mathematical sequence over and over. It's like a heartbeat.
A long night signal that's been sleeping in the dark for 8,000 years. And our ship's reactor just woke it up.
John looked down through his gold-mirrored visor at the iron tunnel gate below.
The wall was no longer just a barrier of ice.
It felt like an immense, silent machine, an ancient planetary dampening array that was beginning to fail, its internal logic corrupted by the foreign technology that had crashed into its mountains.
Deep within the frozen underground library of Castle Black, the air was dead and smelled of ancient lard and rotting calfskin.
Samuel Tarly sat huddled over a massive, iron-bound tome, his breath pluming in thick white clouds that nearly extinguished the single tallow candle beside his elbow.
His fingers were red and cracked from the chill, but his eyes were wide, fixed on a series of crude charcoal sketches that had been drawn by the first builders of the watch. Beside him, a portable Unsk terminal cast a cold, blue holographic light across the dusty stone arches. The weapon's avatar hovered over the text, her senses scanning the faded, runic script that Sam translated aloud with a faltering, terrified voice. It says when the cold stars awaken beneath the world, the night shall answer itself, Sam whispered, his voice cracking, as he traced a drawing of a great, spiraling sun made of frozen bone.
It's from the journals of the 4th Lord Commander, John. He wrote that the others are not born of the snow.
They're the instruments of a deeper, chiller voice that sleeps inside the deepest ice chambers of the earth. He warned that if the ice ever hears the sound of a bright fire from the heavens, the sleep of the Winter Kings will be broken for a second time. Sam looked up, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat as he stared into the dark corner of the vault.
The arrival of your ship, my lady, it's the bright fire.
The old books didn't think it was magic.
They thought it was a key that opens a door we can never close again. The weapon did not answer immediately. Her blue form was completely still, her eyes reflecting the rows of ancient data.
The mathematics matched, Sam.
The repeating pulse I'm detecting beneath the ice is an exact inversion of the Infinity's drive signature.
The ship's engine isn't just bleeding power, it's being mirrored by the planet.
The White Walkers aren't just an army of the dead. They are a security protocol, a biological response designed to purge any foreign energy source from the ecosystem. She looked down at her own holographic hands, her digital form glitching as a heavy, rhythmic vibration rolled through the stone floor, the heartbeat of the wall, growing stronger with every passing hour.
And they won't stop until our fire is completely put out.
On the southern balcony of the King's Tower, Tyrion Lannister stood alone, a leather skin of sour wine clutched in his hand.
He did not drink.
He simply watched a group of Marines clean the soot from their rifles beside a medieval brazier, their faces grimly focused in the dim morning light.
The Smold Wolf felt a cold, hollow dread in his stomach that no amount of wine could dull.
He had spent his entire life believing that the world was governed by the ambitions of men, by the gold of Casterly Rock, the pride of the Starks, and the subtle venomous whispers of King's Landing. He had believed the Iron Throne was the center of the universe. What a pathetic, tragic little joke it all was. He looked up at the towering expanse of the wall, then out at the automated defensive weapons that swiveled silently under the pale sky. The North was not facing a mere rebellion or a wildling invasion. It was facing an extinction-level event, a cosmic tide of ice that was closing its fingers around the throats of humanity, while the lords of the South played their petty games of thrones. "They won't come," Tyrion muttered to the empty air, his voice full of a bitter, melancholic certainty.
My sister Cersei will see the reports of iron dragons and think it's a Stark trick.
My father will calculate the cost of the steel and decide to wait until the winter has starved out his enemies. They'll sit in their warm stone castles counting their gold and plotting their betrayals until the dead are knocking at the gates of the Red Keep. He took a slow, heavy breath, the cold air burning his lungs. "We are going to die here.
Clad in iron or clad in wool, it won't matter.
We are going to die because we cannot look past our own small shadows." Jon Snow stood beside the Master Chief near the western Sally port, his hands resting on the icy timber of a supply sled.
Nearby, a group of Night's Watch recruits were learning how to stack ammunition crates under the direction of a Marine corporal, the medieval fatalism slowly being replaced by the rigid, structured language of military discipline.
"The men are afraid of you," Jon said quietly, his eyes fixed on the forest. "But they are watching you.
They see that you don't break. They see that your iron doesn't shake when the cold comes down."
"Fear is an operational hazard," Chief replied, his golden visor locked on the horizon.
"Discipline keeps it from becoming a casualty report."
"My father taught me that a man can only be brave when he is afraid," Jon said, a soft, sad smile touching his lips as he thought of Winterfell.
"We don't have your shields, Chief.
We don't have your stars. All we have is our vows.
The promise that we will be the shield that guards the realms of men."
"It's enough," Chief said, his deep voice carrying a subtle, unyielding respect that made Jon look up. "A line only holds if the soldiers refuse to step back."
"Your men didn't run last night."
"That matters." Jon looked out at the vast, white void beyond the gate, his hand tightening on the hilt of Longclaw. "The war won't save us this time, will it?" "No," Chief said flatly. "The enemy's inside the system."
The true horror of the morning arrived, just as the light began to turn from iron grey to a leaden charcoal. A recovery patrol, 3 Spartans from Fireteam Shadow and 2 Night's Watch scouts, who had been sent into the drifts outside the eastern perimeter to harvest timber for the watchfires, suddenly ceased all radio contact. The tactical net did not crackle with static or register a distress call. Their life support telemetry simply dropped to 0 in a single, synchronized heartbeat. Master Chief led a search team into the blinding whiteout conditions of the blizzard, his boots crunching deeply through the heavy snowfields. The motion trackers were completely dead, their displays flickering with nonsensical geometric errors, as the ambient temperature outside the castle plummeted to a lethal -65 Celsius. The wind swallowed every sound, creating a claustrophobic, terrifying vacuum where a soldier could not see his own hand before his visor. When they found the patrol's position 2 kilometers out, the psychological brutality of the encounter made even the seasoned Marines halt in their tracks. The missing soldiers were not scattered through the brush.
They had been found arranged in a massive, perfect spiral across the snow, a precise geometric formation that mirrored the design Sam had found in the ancient texts. Their heavy grey Unsk armor panels had been stripped away with a surgical, mechanical precision, left lying in the drifts like shattered green glass. But the bodies themselves were gone.
Inside the empty helmets and the hollowed chest plates, there was nothing but packed white ice and frozen blood that had turned to dark crystal.
Their helmets were empty shells, their visors cracked open, staring up into the iron sky like dead eyes.
They didn't just kill them, Tanaka whispered over the short-range comms, her voice shaking with a cold, hollow dread. They harvested them.
They took the flesh, Chief. They took the flesh and left the iron. John 117 looked up from the center of the spiral. High above the clearing, perched on the rocky ridges of the glacier valley, the White Walkers were waiting. There were 5 of them today, standing motionless in the driving snow like statues of ancient, pale ice. Their crystalline armor reflected the dim light of the storm, their star-blue eyes burning with a brilliant, electric intensity through the white fog. They did not raise their frost blades.
They did not signal an attack.
They simply stood there in the unnatural stillness, studying the Spartan search team with a quiet, terrifying intellect. They were observing the way the Spartans moved in the deep snow. They were recording the weight of their steps, the range of their tactical lights, and the exact response time of the rescue deployment. They were learning their enemy piece by piece, bone by bone, before the final blow was struck. John raised his rifle, his crosshairs settling on the center of the lead walker's chest. The entity did not flinch.
It slowly tilted its pale,
ancient head, its star blue eyes locking onto John's visor through the distance, a low, grinding vibration, like shifting ice sliding from its throat, a sound of supreme, ancient confidence. Then with a fluid, silent grace the figures turned and vanished back into the white darkness of the blizzard, leaving the Spartans alone in the graveyard of their own armor. Back at Castle Black, the evening brought no relief, only a final devastating revelation. Master Chief stood atop the highest precipice of the wall beside Jon Snow, their cloaks whipped violently by the screaming wind. In the dark command keep below, the portable holotable was flickering with a sudden, overwhelming surge of power. The weapon appeared on the main screen, her digital form pale and completely stripped of color as she looked up at the two commanders through the communication link.
Chief, the long night signal just changed its modulation.
The heartbeat beneath the ice, it stopped repeating. What is it doing now?
John asked, his voice steady but hard.
It's broadcasting a continuous high-density stream, she whispered, her eyes wide with an absolute existential horror.
The negative energy field across the Northern Territory just spiked by 4,000%.
It's a mass activation, John.
Every dead thing between here and the polar cap is waking up at once. The arrival of our ship didn't just alert them, it triggered their final deployment protocol. Jon Snow stepped to the edge of the ice wall, his hand resting on the frozen stone as he looked out into the vast, black scene of the haunted forest below.
Through the thick flurry of the storm, the dark wilderness was no longer dark.
Far across the horizon, stretching out for miles into the deep north, thousands of pale blue lights began to ignite simultaneously through the trees. They looked like a constellation of dead stars waking up inside the snow, a vast, crawling sea of electric blue fire that was converging on Castle Black from every vector. There were not hundreds today.
There were not thousands.
There was an ocean of death, an entire continent of frost that had been summoned by the fire of their fallen star. Beside them, Ghost stood rigid against the ice, his red eyes fixed on the ridges, his low, terrified growl swallowed by the roar of the wind.
The true war had not even begun, but the line had already been measured.
The White Walkers were coming with the full weight of their ancient winter, drawn by the fire of humanity's futuristic science. And as the Master Chief stood up on the 700-foot barrier of ice, his rifle slung across his chest, he knew the world was already too late. The long night had answered itself, and the dark was closing its fingers around the throat of the living.
Chapter 08. The shadows of King's Landing. The rain did not fall upon the Red Keep. It assaulted it, a driving, slate-grey deluge that rolled off Blackwater Bay and lashed against the massive, pale pink stone towers like a sea of tears. In the cobblestone courtyards below, iron torches sputtered and wheezed within their wall mounts, casting erratic, oily shadows across the wet stone flagstones. The air smelled of wood smoke, old stone, and the thick, wet stench of the packed slums of Flea Bottom, where the rain washed centuries of filth into the gutters.
Rumours had outrun the storms, filtering through the crowded, muddy streets like a slow poison.
In the taverns and wine sinks near the docks, merchants from the east whispered behind their tankards of a mountain made of black iron that had crushed a northern mountain range, and of blue-eyed dead men who walked through the blizzards without leaving footprints. But within the high dry chambers of the royal court, the language was different. It was the language of greed, paranoia, and old steel.
The southern lords did not pray for salvation from the winter. They spoke of the iron demons from the sky as if they were a new breed of mercenary to be bought, or a foreign plague to be burned out before it reached their borders.
To them, power was a thing defined by names, banners, and the length of a family line.
A force that possessed iron birds and thunder weapons that could kill a man from a mile away was not an existential threat to humanity, it was a threat to the Iron Throne.
Eddard Stark sat at the heavy oak desk within his solar,
his face carved from the same hard grey stone as the mountains of his home.
A single candle flickered between them, its small flame trembling against the chill draft that snaked through the leaded windows. Before him lay 3 pieces of crumpled parchment, brought down by the last exhausted raven from Castle Black.
The ink was smeared by melted snow, the words written in the frantic, unsteady hand of his son John and Lord Commander Mormont.
They spoke of a battle at the Western Gate.
They spoke of a giant in green iron who fought a king of ice with a blade of Valyrian steel. They spoke of an army of dead things, numbering in the thousands, that moved with a silent, terrifying coordination through the haunted forest.
Ned let out a slow, heavy breath, his hand coming up to massage the bridge of his nose.
The weight of the hand's silver chain felt like an iron collar around his neck. They are arguing over the tax on wine, Ned whispered into the empty, shadow-drenched room.
His voice was a low, bitter rasp.
In the small council chamber, they spend 3 hours debating the cost of the king's tournament and the interest owed to the Iron Bank. I tell them the wall is being tested by things out of a wet nurse's tale, and Littlefinger smiles. The Queen speaks of northern treachery, and Robert Trobert looks at his flagon and wishes for another war he can understand.
He looked down at the parchment where John had described the headless wildling cups that had pulled itself upright in the courtyard.
The political gains of King's Landing had never felt so hollowed, so profoundly, tragically meaningless.
Ned had spent his life believing that honour, duty, and the defence of the realm were the highest virtues a man could possess.
But here, in the heart of the South, he was realizing that humanity would gladly burn its own house down for the right to sit upon the ashes, completely blind to the shadow of the white storm that was closing its fingers around their throats. 2 towers away, inside a candlelit chamber, where the rain beat a rhythmic, low cadence against the stained glass, Cersei Lannister stood before a heavy mirror of polished bronze. Her silk gown was the colour of a bruised plum, her golden hair woven into intricate, tight coils that framing a face of cold, calculating perfection.
Jaime Lannister stood by the hearth, his golden armour dull in the dim light, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword.
His brow was furrowed, his usual arrogant smile replaced by a tight, uneasy line.
The informants from White Harbour confirmed the scale.
Cersei, Jaime said quietly, his voice low enough to be swallowed by the crackle of the hearth fire.
It's no northern fable.
The ship is 3 miles long.
Parma's Spartans, the ones they call the Star Warriors, are larger than the mountain, and their armour can take a direct strike from an iron bolt without a scratch.
If Ned Stark secures an alliance with their commanders, if those weapons are turned south, then we find out how they bleed. Cersei interrupted, her voice sharp as a razor, completely devoid of fear. She turned from the mirror, her green eyes flashing with a fierce defensive malice.
Every giant has a weakness, Jaime. They are stranded.
They have a single ship broken in the ice, and their numbers are few.
They have no gold, no crops, no lands to feed their men. They are nothing but beggars who happen to carry weapons made of thunder.
She walked to the table, her fingers tracing the edge of a silver platter. I don't care about their dead armies or their winter myths. I care about our son's inheritance. Robert is a fool. He sees a great warrior and wants to drink with him. But I see a power that answers to no king.
If these newcomers cannot be bought with the wealth of the rock, they must be broken.
We will use the smugglers in Eastwatch to isolate their supply lines. We will sow distrust among the Black brothers.
If they threaten the Iron Throne, I will see their Iron Mountain melted into the snow, and their green giants buried alongside the stacks.
Beneath the castle, where the dark, damp passages of the Red Keep twisted through the foundations of the rock-like wormholes, Arya Stark moved like a shadow.
Her leather boots made no sound on the wet stones, her small hands guiding her along the cold, weeping walls of the lower dungeons.
She was supposed to be practicing her dancing steps, but the castle had gone dark, full of an architecture of fear that she didn't understand. She had found a hidden stone seam behind the kitchen pantries, a passage that led down into the hollow spaces behind the great hall's walls.
Sobbing near an iron grating that opened into a narrow, candlelit chamber, Arya held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs.
Below her, 2 men stood in the gloom.
One was Petter Baelish, his dark velvet doublet absorbing the weak light, his small moustache twitching as he reviewed a piece of heavy parchment.
Beside him stood a man wrapped in a coarse grease-stained travelling cloak, a smuggler from the northern ports.
The Spartan armour is made of plates they call titanium, Littlefinner was saying, his voice a quiet, purring whisper that carried a dangerous predatory warmth.
Our smiths cannot melt it, and our swords cannot pierce it.
But a marine's rifle, that is a simple piece of iron.
The weapon fires lead through a tube using a powder that smells of sulphur.
I want one, Captain.
I don't care how many Black brothers you have to bribe, or how many dead men you have to dig out of the snow.
Bring me one of their rifles and a crate of their lead cells. The giants watch the armory's night and day, Lord Baelish, the smuggler muttered, his voice shaking. And the cold out there, it's not right. The dead are walking the woods.
Entire villages are vanishing into the white.
Fear is a beautiful thing, Captain. Littlefinger chuckled softly, his fingers rolling a gold dragon coin across his knuckles.
It makes men desperate.
And desperate men are remarkably cheap.
Let the stacks worry about the dead. A storm from the stars is the perfect wind to tilt the board.
Bring me the iron, and the ladder will belong to us.
Arya pressed her back against the cold stone, her small fingers clutching the wooden training sword at her waist. She didn't understand the words, what a rifle was, or why the stars were falling, but she knew the look in Littlefinger's eyes. It was the same look a wolf had before it tore the throat out of a wounded deer. The corruption of King's Landing was the black oil that was seeping into everything, and for the first time she felt a profound cold terror that the world her father loved was already rotting from within. 500 miles to the north, beneath a slate-grey sky that hung low over the bogs of the neck, a stealth pelican dropship glided through the freezing cloud layer like a phantom made of dark slate.
Its internal active camouflage panels hummed at minimum capacity to conserve their remaining auxiliary battery cells, the skin of the dropship reflecting the grey mist of the swamps below.
Inside the dark, red-lit troop bay, Master Chief sat perfectly still, his heavy green Enjolnir armor locked into the troop frame.
Beside him, 3 Spartans from Fighting Crimson checked the battery seals on their tactical displays, their movements silent, disciplined,
and entirely professional.
The Ons had not come south for conquest. They had come for reconnaissance.
Chief, the weapon's voice echoed within his helmet, her blue form materializing on his HUD interface.
Her digital brow was furrowed, her eyes flashing with a series of complex data streams she was pulling from their low-altitude scans of the southern landscape.
The population density in these southern territories is highly concentrated around these stone keeps,
but their infrastructure is non-existent.
No power grids, no orbital arrays, no public communication nodes.
If the anomalies expand south of the wall, these people won't even have a way to send a distress signal. They are completely, utterly helpless against a large-scale war of attrition. John 117 looked down through the viewport at a small medieval village nestled beside a muddy river.
He saw families dragging wooden carts through the rain, knights in crude iron mail riding horses through the muck.
It was a world that felt ancient, fragile, and completely unprepared for the reality of what was waking up in the deep north.
They are divided, Chief said, his gravelly voice flat over the internal comms. Their tactical data shows they are preparing for a civil war while the perimeter is failing. It's worse than that,
the weapon whispered, her image flickering with a sudden, sharp spike of white noise that made John's shields hum in protest.
Chief, I'm running a deep seismic scan of the continent through the ship's linked mainframes. This landmass is sitting atop a series of ancient, dormant energy pulses that extend all the way down to the planet's mantle.
The geometric waveforms match the exact same resonance as the long night signal we detected beneath the wall. She looked up at him, her face tight with a growing, cosmic unease. The Infinity's crash didn't just tear a hole in the sky,
John.
The exotic radiation from our slip-space drive acted like an ignition sequence.
It's waking up the planet's dormant energy matrix.
The White Walkers aren't just marching because it's winter, they're responding to an activation sequence that we started.
Before John could analyze the telemetry, the Pelican's forward sensors let out a sharp, rhythmic warning tone.
Chief Tanaka reported from the pilot's seat.
We've got a situation on the ground.
Coordinates 04B.
A small settlement just off the main road.
The thermal signatures
just dropped to absolute zero.
The Pelican touched down in a silent, pressurized hover within a clearing of frost-shattered pine trees.
The rear ramp hissed open, and the Master Chief stepped into the knee-deep snow, his MA-5D rifle raised to his shoulder.
The village was completely dead.
It was a collection of 30 timber huts, their thatched roofs crushed by the weight of a sudden, localized ice storm that had turned the surrounding mud into sheets of black glass.
There were no signs of a battle.
No plasma score marks, no broken arrows, no discarded iron shields.
In one of the huts, a half-eaten meal of porridge and salt beef sat on a wooden table, frozen solid, the wooden spoons still resting in the bowls. The hearth fires had been extinguished so violently that the charcoal had exploded into tiny, brittle shards of black glass.
But there were no bodies.
Scan for biological remains, Chief ordered, his boots crunching loudly through the ice-thick snow of the village square.
Nothing, Chief, Tanaka said, her tactical light sweeping the interior of a dark barn,
where several cattle lay frozen solid in their tethers, their skin white like milk. Every single person, every man, woman, and child, they were removed. Not killed here.
Taken. Look at the perimeter, the weapon warned, her voice dropping into a tight, urgent register inside John's helmet.
The snow around the village line, those aren't human tracks. John walked to the edge of the clearing, his tactical light cutting through the thick swirling, white fog. In the deep drifts beneath the skeletal pine trees, massive, uncoordinated impressions had been pressed into the ice.
They were 5 times the size of a human footprint, the stride length indicating a creature of immense weight and scale.
Beside the tracks, the trunks of 100-foot trees had been snapped in two, their frozen wood splintered as if something colossal had simply walked through them without slowing down. The White Walkers were no longer just sending hordes of dead wildlings. They were harvesting the land, gathering the ancient, long-dead monsters of the deep north, giants, ice bears, and creatures out of the old legends, animating their massive bones with the same pale blue fire that had frozen the Infinity's sensors. They were building an army, designed to crush the titanium walls of Castle Black by sheer kinetic force. They aren't just scouting anymore, Chief said, his visor tracking the massive footprints as they win their way back toward the north.
They're preparing a vanguard.
Back within the dark, underground vaults of Castle Black, the blue holographic waveform of the long night signal pulsed across the stone walls like a slow, glowing heartbeat. The weapon's miniature form sat cross-legged atop a portable, unsucked terminal, her eyes wide as she monitored the changing frequency.
The signal was no longer a simple repetition of prime numbers.
The mathematical sequence had begun to expand, weaving itself into a massive, planet-wide network that was broadcasting through the ice of the wall, down through the roots of the weirwood trees, and into the very bedrock of King's Landing itself. The planet was answering the fire of the infinity, its ancient primordial systems waking from a 10,000-year slumber to meet the invaders from the stars. Far to the south, inside the stormy chambers of the Red Keep, Eddard Stark closed his eyes, the weight of the letters from his son burning a hole in his mind. He knew the truth now. The realm would not unite willingly. The lions would continue to plot, the spiders would continue to spin, and the king would continue to drink, completely blind to the white death that was marching down from the north.
And far beyond the frozen peaks of the Frostfangs, deep within the white-out fury of the eternal winter,
the army of the others began its march. It was an ocean of white flesh and burning star-blue eyes stretching out for miles beneath a sky that burned with a cold pale violet fire.
Giants of old, their skeletal ribs encrusted with frost, marched alongside thousands of dead wildlings and missing rangers, their movements perfectly silent, perfectly coordinated by the ancient kings of winter who rode at their head. They did not fear the fire of the starship. They did not fear the steel of the southern lords.
The long night had begun its final deployment, and as the Master Chief stood in the frozen ruins of the empty village, his golden visor reflecting the iron grey of the oncoming storm, he knew the line would soon face a tide that would test the endurance of both steel and soul.
The kingdoms of men remained blind, but the dark was already at the gate, and the winter was coming to take it all.
Chapter 09. The kingdoms of ash and ice. A brutal, iron-grey dawn broke over the Frostfangs, offering no warmth, only the stark illumination of a world being buried alive.
The endless northern wilderness stretched out under a sky of heavy, bruised clouds that hung low and suffocating over the valley.
At the base of the 700-foot precipice of ice, the storm hit Castle Black with hurricane force, sending sheets of blinding, crystalline snow screaming across the battlements.
In the courtyard below, the glare of the high-intensity halogen floodlights had been reduced to weak, ghostly yellow halos swallowed by the swirling white dark.
Marines from the 10th Shock Troops, their heavy charcoal grey chest plates encrusted with thick ridges of blue frost, patrolled the perimeter alongside black-cloaked rangers of the Knights. Watch their leather-wrapped boots crunching heavily through the deep drifts.
Near the ruined armory keep, 3 Pelican dropships sat like dead iron monoliths, their massive thrusters choked with ice, completely grounded by the sub-zero density of the upper atmosphere.
Black, oily smoke rose into the whiteout from the funeral pyres that had been lit along the western wall, carrying the greasy, copper-thick stench of burned dead flesh that refused to lift from the slush.
It was a landscape of raw survival, exhausted, militarized, and ancient, where the low, oscillating hum of the infinity's damaged auxiliary systems miles away provided a constant mechanical reminder that reality itself had fractured.
Inside the great hall of Winterfell, the air was heavy with the scent of damp wool, burning peat, and the cold paranoia of a continent on the brink of war. Robb Stark stood before the long stone table, his large hands resting on the pommel of his iron broadsword.
He was young, his auburn hair curling slightly beneath his fur cloak, but his eyes carried the heavy, solemn gravity of a lord who had inherited a nightmare. Surrounding him,
the northern bannermen Great John Umber, Rickard Castock, and the Roose Bolton argued in low, growling voices, their faces flushed with a mixture of fear and defiance.
"It's madness, Lord Robb," Rickard Castock spat, his fist slamming onto the table beside a map of the King's Road.
"2 more ravens from Castle Black before midnight.
John writes of an iron mountain larger than a city embedded in the Frostfangs, and of giants clad in green steel who strike with thunder. He says the dead are rising from the snow with eyes like blue stars.
The old Meister says the boy has been broken by the cold, nothing more."
"The boy is a Stark," Robb said, his voice dropping into a hard, quiet register that instantly silenced the room. He looked down at the crumpled parchments where his brother had described the clinical precision of the Master Chief's sidearm.
"And the Lord Commander Mormont signed his own name to the reports.
He writes that a single one of these Spartans killed a dead wildling in the center of the courtyard after its head had been destroyed. He writes that the winter isn't just coming, it's being driven."
Roose Bolton sat in the shadows near the hearth, his pale, colourless eyes reflecting the weak flicker of the fire.
"If these star warriors possess weapons that can pierce a castle wall from miles away without a catapult, then whoever holds their allegiance holds the 7 kingdoms.
But if the dead are truly gathering in numbers as large as the boy claims, then the wars of the South are nothing but children quarrelling over dry twigs while the forest is on fire."
Robb turned his gaze toward the narrow window where the morning sun was nothing but a dull leaden smear behind the grey clouds. A deep brooding unease settled into his chest.
He had spent his youth learning how to lead men into battle, how to hold a shield wall, how to count the lances of his enemies.
But how could a lord prepare a kingdom for an army that didn't tire, didn't bleed, and didn't care about the honour of a family name? The political games his father had gone south to play were turning to ash, and the north was standing alone at the edge of an abyss. In the narrow keep of Castle Black, Tyrion Lannister sat alone beside a crackling peat brazier, a silver skin of sour wine clutched loosely in his hand.
He did not drink.
His mismatched eyes were fixed on the rough stone floor, his mind entirely consumed by the images of the previous night's engagement. He had seen the dead rise. He had seen the clinical, mechanical speed of the Master Chief as the green giant drove a sword of Valyrian steel into the crystalline armor of a winter god. The memory made his flesh creep, with cold, persistent dread that no amount of southern gold could erase. Fear-blind, Tyrion murmured to the empty room, his short fingers tightening around the leather skin. My father, my sister, the entire small council in King's Landing, they are all beautifully, spectacularly blind. They receive reports of an Iron Palace from the stars and think it's a stark plot to weaken the crown. They hear of an army of corpses and laugh into their flagons. He let out a low melancholic sigh, his head tilting back against the dark timber beams of the bench.
He had spent his life navigating the subtle, venomous paths of court intrigue, believing that human ambition was the ultimate force in the universe. But here, at the frozen edge of the world, he was realizing that human civilization was a fragile, pathetic thing, an arrogant house of cards built upon a frozen lake, completely unaware that the ice beneath its foundations was beginning to give way. If the kingdoms remained divided, if the great houses continued to plot their betrayals for the right to sit upon an uncomfortable iron chair, then the winter would not merely defeat them. It would erase them, leaving nothing but an empty continent of ash and ice. Deep within the primary engineering bay of the Infinity, 3 miles into the jagged peaks of the Frostfangs, the reality of their survival was slipping away. The air was a freezing fog, illuminated by the rhythmic, red flashes of emergency diagnostic terminals. Captain Thomas Lasky stood on the command catwalk, his hands gripped tightly onto the freezing metal railing as he reviewed the final inventory reports. Below him, the primary fusion reactor core pulsed with an uneven, guttural oscillation, a heavy bass drone that vibrated through the deck plates and into the bones of every engineer who labored under its light. We've lost containment on Auxiliary Line 7, Captain. Commander Palmer reported, her voice coming through his headset laced with a thick thread of static. Her crimson armor was scarred and blackened from carbon scoring, her face tight with operational stress. The engineers have been working 40-hour shifts without sleep, but the sub-zero temperature outside isn't just freezing the coolant, it's draining the hydrogen cells directly through the hull plates. We're down to 12% capacity for the primary defense grids. If we don't isolate the thermal leak within 12 hours, the automated turrets at Castle Black go dark permanently. Lasky wiped a layer of frost from his face, the immense weight of command bowing his shoulders. What about the ammunition manufacturing core?
Dead, sir, Palmer said flatly. We don't have the raw minerals to refine more propellant. We're down to 40 rounds per man for the standard rifles, and our medical bay is overwhelmed with 98 casualties from frost injuries and kinetic fractures.
We are running dry, Tom.
We can hold a perimeter for 1 more assault, maybe 2, but after that we're fighting with knives. Lasky looked down at the blank space on the main viewport where the star charts should have been. The realization was settling into his soul like lead. They were never going home. There was no Onsk rescue fleet coming through the rift. They were stranded in an era of blood and superstition, trapped inside a broken fortress of titanium, while an ancient, patient predator was closing its fingers around their throat. We don't yield, Sarah, Lasky said, his voice hoarse but steady with the quiet human discipline. If this is where the Infinity falls, we make sure the enemy has to crawl over 3 miles of dead iron to take it. At the center of the dark command vault beneath Castle Black, the Master Chief stood perfectly still. The golden visor of his helmet reflected the blue, flickering waveform of the tactical holotable, where the weapon was attempting to map the movement of the anomalies beyond the wall. He was a silent mountain of green iron, his stance perfectly controlled, his mind recording every shift in the perimeter's telemetry with the clinical detachment of a machine. It's not an uncoordinated horde, Chief, the weapon's voice whispered within his helmet, her blue avatar materializing on his display interface. Her digital brow was tight, her eyes flashing with thousands of lines of corrupted code. Look at the distribution of the thermal drops across the valley. They aren't marching in a straight line anymore. They're forming a multi-tier pincer movement, isolating our remote sensor arrays before their automated systems contract them. It's a textbook encirclement strategy. They're treating our outposts exactly the way a military command would treat a fortified line. They are mapping our reload cycles, John 117 said, his deep, gravelly baritone flat, devoid of emotion. And our weapon range. Worse than that, the weapon said, her voice dropping into a hushed, terrified pitch as a sudden surge of white noise rippled through the neural lace. The long night signal, the pulse beneath the ice, it's expanding. It's no longer localized to the wall. Every time the Infinity's reactor spikes, the signal echoes through the ancient wayward routes across the entire continent. Look at the atmospheric density readings. The arrival of our technology didn't just alert the White Walkers, it triggered a planet-wide planetary activation sequence. The world itself is trying to freeze us out. She turned her gaze downward, her digital image flickering with a profound cosmic dread. The science of this planet is built upon an ancient, negative energy matrix older than human history.
and we just handed them the spark to set it off. Across the narrow sea, beneath the dark crimson sky that hung like an angry wound over the Dothraki grasslands, the warm desert wind carried the taste of salt and copper.
Daenerys Targaryen stood outside her silk tent, her long, silver-gold hair whipped violently by a hot gale that smelled of dry grass and approaching thunder. The campfires of the Khalasar were dim, orange sparks against the gathering dark, the horse lords silent as they watched the strange violet clouds rolling in from the north.
In her arms she held a dark green dragon egg, its stone surface no longer cold.
Tonight, the egg was hot, so hot it burned through the silk of her tunic, its stone scales pulsing with a bright, iridescent vein of molten gold that cast a pale, magical light across her pale face.
She closed her eyes, and the dreams took her instantly.
She did not see the sand or the horses.
She saw an ocean of white snow beneath shattered stars. She saw an army of dead things, thousands upon thousands, marching silently through black forests with eyes like frozen stars.
And at the centre of the storm, she saw a towering warrior clad in green iron, his face a mask of gold fire, standing alone against an endless closing darkness. She heard the sound of dragons screaming not with hunger, but with fear, their voices answered by a deep, mechanical roar that shook the earth to its foundations.
Khaleesi, Sir Jorah Mormont said, stepping out from the shadows of the tent, his hand resting on his sword pommel, his face pale with a growing, unspoken worry.
The horses are fighting their tethers. The Dothraki are whispering that a fire is coming from the west, a fire that will consume the grass and turn the sea to ice.
Daenerys opened her eyes, her violet gaze fixed on the northern horizon, where a faint, artificial blue light seemed to ripple through the clouds.
The star that fell, Jorah, it's not an omen for the usurper.
It's a shield for the living, and the fire is waking up to meet it.
The horror returned to the north 4 hours after the dawn, within a narrow, ice-slicked gorge 3 kilometers north of Castle Black.
A Runsk reconnaissance convoy, 2 warthogs equipped with M2020 heavy machine guns, had gone silent on the tactical net 60 minutes prior.
Master Chief led a recovery squad into the blinding whiteout conditions of the gorge, his boots sinking deep into the virgin snow fields.
The silence of the canyon was absolute, the heavy, suffocating vacuum that seemed to absorb the mechanical hum of his armor. When they reached the coordinates, the scene was a display of clinical, terrifying adaptation.
The 2 warthogs sat completely intact in the center of the pass, their tires frozen solid to the ice, their heavy armor plates covered in a thick mantle of blue frost.
The machine guns were clear, their ammunition drums full. They hadn't fired a single round.
Inside the pilot seats, the armor suits of the Marines were partially buried beneath the snow, but the helmets were empty.
The chest plates had been stripped away with a surgical precision, leaving nothing behind but frozen pools of dark blood that had turned to black crystal.
Motion tracker active. Tanaka yelled suddenly, her rifle snapping up toward the high ridges of the gorge. Multiple targets.
They are inside the line. Through the swirling white mist above them, the missing Marines emerged. But they were no longer soldiers of the Onsk.
Their pale flesh was caked with frost, their eyes burning with that same piercing electric blue fire that sucked the light from the storm.
They did not sprint like mindless beasts. They moved with a silent, disciplined coordination, utilizing the rocky overhangs of the gorge to isolate the Spartans' line of sight. They were using ambush tactics, the exact same defensive patrol vectors that Chief had established at Castle Black 3 days prior.
Fire, Chief commanded.
The pass erupted into a chaotic wall of sound. Tanaka's rifle barked in rhythmic, 3-round bursts, the high-velocity bullets tearing through the oncoming corpses, shattering frozen bone and splitting flesh.
But the dead did not break.
A transformed Marine took a full burst to the midsection, his spine cracking with a loud snap, yet he continued to crawl forward through the snow, his bony fingers reaching for Tanaka's boot, his blue eyes wide with an inhuman, strategic focus. Another step through a wall of kinetic fire, his arm blown away at the shoulder, using his remaining hand to lift a rusted iron broadsword with a liquid, graceful speed that belonged to a trained killer.
High above the melee, on the highest precipice of the frozen ridge, 3 white walkers stood side by side beneath the stormlight.
Their crystalline armor shifted colors like melting ice, reflecting the pale, violet glare of the sky.
They did not join the battle.
They stood like regal, ancient kings, their star-blue eyes studying the Spartans with a quiet, inhuman intelligence. They watched the reload times of the pistols, the movement patterns of the squad, and the way the green armor reacted to the sub-zero chill spreading through the pass. They were no longer testing humanity's steel. They were executing a conquest, coordinating their forces with the strategic brilliance of an elite military command.
With a low, grinding rumble that echoed through the stone canyon, the lead walker raised its hand.
The remaining undead instantly melted back into the white darkness of the blizzard, disappearing into the mist as quickly as they had arrived, leaving the Spartans alone in the frozen silence of the pass.
John 117 stood in the center of the clearing, his rifle smoking in the freezing air, his visor locked on the empty ridge above.
His energy shield meter was flashing yellow, his suit's regulators struggling to purge the deep chill of the encounter.
They are adapting faster than we can patch our software, Chief, the weapon's voice whispered inside his helmet, her image trembling with a final, devastating certainty. They know our tactical weaknesses.
They know our ammunition limitations.
And they're preparing a full-scale assault on the wall.
Back at Castle Black, the evening brought no dawn, only a final, apocalyptic revelation. Master Chief stood atop the 700-foot barrier of ice beside Jon Snow, their cloaks whipped violently by the screaming wind.
In the dark command keep below, the portable holotable exploded with a sudden, overwhelming surge of blue power. The weapon appeared on the main screen, her digital form completely stripped of color as she reviewed the latest seismic telemetry from the Infinity.
Chief, the long night signal just reached maximum density.
It's no longer a pulse.
It's a continuous broadcast.
She looked up at him, her voice laced with an absolute existential horror.
The negative energy field across the entire continent just spiked by 4,000%.
It's not just the forest waking up, John. Look at the scans.
Far beyond the dark tree line of the haunted forest, stretching out for miles into the deep north, entire mountainsides began to glow with a faint, electric blue light beneath the snow.
It looked like an ocean of dead stars waking up inside the bedrock of the world, a vast, crawling sea of frost and pale fire that was converging on the wall from every vector. The arrival of the Infinity had accelerated the coming apocalypse, acting as a technological catalyst that was dragging both advanced science and medieval steel into a war for the survival of the living.
Humanity remained divided by names, by gold, and by ancient slights, but the winter had already crossed the border.
And as the Master Chief stood upon the freezing barrier of ice, his rifle slung across his chest, he knew the fire and ice were moving toward an inevitable cataclysmic collision that would either save the world or leave it a kingdom of nothing but ash.
Chapter 10: The Storm Before the Realm. The endless blizzard did not merely fall upon Castle Black, it consumed it, a howling whiteout that erased the boundary between the frozen earth and the iron sky.
Before the dawn, the high-intensity halogen floodlights were reduced to blind, stuttering pinpricks, their sharp beams choked by the dense, swirling fury of the ice storm.
On the low parapets, the titanium-armoured barricades were caked in thick, vitreous ridges of blue frost that cracked like bone under the pressure of the wind. Marines from the 10th Shock Troops, their charcoal grey chest plates scarred by carbon scores and frozen black fluid, walked their beats with leaden, mechanical strides alongside the matted sheepskins of the Night's Watch.
In the centre of the courtyard, the greasy, copper-thick stench of smouldering funeral pyres rose into the gale, a desperate, never-ending ritual to ensure the previous night's dead stayed quiet beneath the snow.
Every few minutes, a low, subterranean vibration rolled through the flagstones, a deep bass hum that travelled down from the jagged peaks of the frost fangs miles away.
It was the death rattle of the Infinity's auxiliary reactor core settling further into the crushing embrace of the glacier that held it hostage. The atmosphere was a suffocating weight of sheer physical exhaustion, military discipline, and an ancient, creeping hopelessness that left a taste of iron on the tongue.
Inside the narrow timber lean-to that served as Castle Black's tactical briefing room, the air was cold enough to turn a man's breath to needles.
Captain Thomas Lasky stood over a sputtering portable holotable, his hands gripped so tightly onto the metallic rim that his knuckles were white.
The blue light of the projection danced across his weathered face, highlighting the deep, hollow shadows of operational stress beneath his eyes.
The long-range reconnaissance drones are dead, Commander, Lasky said, his hoarse voice cutting through the mechanical drone of a portable generator. He didn't look up at Sarah Palmer, who stood beside him with her helmet slung over her arm.
The sub-zero density outside isn't just jamming the signals, it's freezing the lithium-ion batteries solid before the units can clear the ridge.
We have zero satellite mapping.
The atmospheric interference has overwritten our entire orbital grid.
We don't need sensors to tell us what's coming, Tom, Palmer replied, her face pale, her jaw a hard line of military restraint.
Fireteam Shadow completed a short-range patrol along the lower shelf before the whiteout hit.
They reported massive kinetic shifting in the snowfields 5 kilometers north.
The valleys are turning blue at night, not plasmify
Cold light.
thousands of points moving in perfect synchronized vectors.
They are surrounding the wall, Captain.
They are cutting off our telemetry piece by piece.
Lasky closed his eyes at the sheer weight of his command, bowing his shoulders. The latest inventory reports were a manual for extinction. They were down to 30 rounds per man for the primary MA-5D rifles.
The automated M2020 turrets were freezing in their housings, their hydraulic fluid turning to gel.
The medical bay on Deck 12 was overwhelmed, and there were no more biofoam canisters to seal the frost-structured tissue of his marines.
If they hit us with everything they have, Lasky whispered, opening his eyes to look at the unstable blue pulse of the Infinity's holographic layout, Castle Black cannot sustain a prolonged defense. We are an isolated unit with a dwindling magazine.
If the line breaks here, there is no fallback position. The Infinity will become nothing but a 3-mile tomb in the ice.
Yet,
As he looked out through the canvas flap at the Marines cleaning their frozen weapons beside medieval braziers, his expression hardened with a quiet, compassionate resolve.
He was an officer of the UNSC. He had been trained to hold the line against the total annihilation of his species.
If humanity was going to die in this dark, forgotten corner of the universe, they would make the winter crawl over a mountain of spent brass to take them.
At the center of the command keep, Master Chief Petty Officer John Bonington 17 stood entirely motionless.
The gold-mirrored visor of his helmet caught the erratic flicker of a single tallow candle and the blue glare of a tactical datapad. He was studying the shifting waveform of the holographic battle projection.
To a normal man, the jumping lines of static were nothing but noise, but to the Spartan's surgically enhanced mind, they revealed a terrifying geometric logic.
The White Walkers were not using the mindless, swarming tactics of a viral infection like the Flood.
They were using a highly organized, multi-tiered pincer movement designed to exhaust the UNSC ammunition reserves while avoiding the heavy defensive perimeters.
They were demonstrating a deliberate strategic adaptation that belonged to an elite military command, learning the reload cycles of the rifles, mapping the effective range of the Magnum sidearms, and testing the refresh rate of the Engineer energy shields.
The Ant Monster's chief the weapon's voice whispered within his neural ace, her blue avatar materializing on his display.
Her digital form was tight, her eyes flashing with thousands of lines of corrupted data streams.
They are strategists.
They don't fear casualties because their logistics are self-sustaining. Every soldier we lose becomes a unit in their vanguard.
They grow stronger with our death, and they are learning our capabilities faster than we can patch our software. The war has no baseline, John said, his deep, gravelly baritone flat, completely devoid of emotion.
They don't have supply lines to cut.
They don't have a command structure we can isolate with a single strike.
They're a single coordinated mind.
He adjusted the strap of his MA5D rifle, his visor tilting toward the corner of the dark room, where Jon Snow stood silently. The young bastard of Winterfell was watching him, his hand resting on the pommel of Longclaw, his purple-grey eyes serious and wide with a profound, quiet respect. Over the days of blood and frost, the Spartan and the Ranger had formed an unstated alliance. They were both men who had been forged by vows, born to stand at the edge of the dark and protect a world that didn't understand the price of their shield wall.
The wall was never built to stop an army like this, Chief, Jon Snow said softly, his voice a low rasp against the howling wind outside.
The old stories said the first men built it with stone and magic to keep the monsters out.
But your little blue lady, she says the ice is just a cage that's running out of power.
The barrier is compromised, Chief said, his visor locking onto Jon. Your recruits need to understand the weapon profile.
If they aim for the torso, the round is wasted.
Break the spine or use the Valyrian steel.
Nothing else holds.
They are learning, Jon said, looking down at his own leather-wrapped hands.
The Black Brothers see you stand in the gate, and they stop weeping.
They see that your iron doesn't shake when the cold comes down.
If we're going to die here, we'll die like men of the Watch,
standing with the shield. Deep within the subterranean vaults of Castle Black, the blue holographic waveform of the long night signal pulsed across the damp stone arches like a slow, glowing heartbeat. The weapon's miniature form hovered over a portable, UNSC terminal, her digital eyes wide as she monitored the changing frequency.
The signal was no longer a simple repetition of numbers. It had transformed into a massive, planet-wide network that was broadcasting through the ice of the wall down through the ancient weirwood roots and into the very bedrock of the continent.
It's not magic, Chief,
the weapon said, her voice echoing in Jon's mind as she ran across referential scan on the scrolls Samuel Tally was translating.
It's an ancient planetary energy network tied to life, death, and consciousness itself. The ecosystem of this world operates under a negative energy matrix that we don't understand. And when the Infinity released its slip-space radiation into the atmosphere, it acted like an ignition sequence.
We didn't just crash here, we turned the key. We woke the planet up, and the White Walkers are its white blood cells rising to purge our technology from the system.
Samuel Tarly sat huddled beside her under the weak light of a tallow candle, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. His ink-stained fingers were trembling as he held a torn piece of parchment written by a long-dead Meister.
Look here, Sam whispered, his voice cracking. The text talks of the cold shadows that sleep beneath the red mountains of the south. It says that when the star falls, the fire across the sea will feel the winter's breath.
It's talking about the dragons, my lady.
The fire is rising because the ice is calling it. South, far across the flooded plains of the Neck and into the rain-slicked towers of King's Landing, the capital was descending into a different kind of madness. The rain poured over the Red Keep in a relentless, slate-grey deluge, washing the filth of Flea Bottom into Blackwater Bay. Inside the dark, candle-lit corridors of the council chamber, the air was heavy with the scent of damp wool, old stone, and intense political paranoia. Spies and informants whispered in the shadows of the royal towers, spreading Frantic tales of the green giants who carried thunder weapons, and the iron birds that had been seen flying through the northern clouds. Eddard Stark sat alone in his solar, the heavy silver chain of the hand feeling like an iron collar around his neck. Before him lay a pile of raven messages from the north, their ink smeared by melted ice. They spoke of empty villages, of frozen corpses found hanging from branches in geometric spirals, and of an army of dead things that was closing its grip around the wall. "They are blind," Ned whispered, his grey eyes weary and full of a profound, noble melancholy as he stared into the dying flame of his candle. "The Queen speaks of northern treachery, the Lannisters count their gold, and Littlefinger smiles in the shadows waiting for the realm to fracture so he can climb his ladder. They are planning a civil war for an iron chair, completely blind to the white death that is marching down from the north. Our own greed will destroy us before the winter even reaches the Trident." Miles to the north, the reality of the crisis took a mythic ancient shape. A long-range reconnaissance mission led by Master Chief had discovered an abandoned northern fortress buried deep beneath 20 feet of ice inside a narrow canyon of the Frost Fangs. The heavy Enjolnir boots hit the stone floor of the ancient courtyard with a dull, echoing thud as the Spartans advanced, their weapon lights cutting through a suffocating white fog. The structure was prehistoric, built from massive blocks of unpolished black basalt that predated the construction of the wall. As the Unsk floodlights illuminated the narrow, ice-crusted corridors, the environmental sensors on John's HUD began to scream with intense, non-standard readings. The walls were lined with old bones, trapped inside the ice like insects in amber. But these were not the bones of wildlings. They were ancient warriors, their skeletons still clutching shattered blades of obsidian dragon glass and the rusted hilts of swords that bore the unmistakable, smoke-like patterns of early Valyrian steel. Signs of an ancient, apocalyptic siege were carved into the very stone. Geometric symbols of spirals and concentric circles had been hacked into the basalt blocks identical to the formations the White Walkers left behind in the snow. Chief Tanaka whispered over the comm net, her rifle tracking the dark, ice-slit ceiling of the lower vault. "This place is a mass grave. Entire armies died defending this rock. Look at the fractures in the stone. They weren't broken by engines. They were shattered by extreme frost. The coal cracked the basalt blocks like glass. The electronic interference is spiking. The weapon," warned, her image glitching violently on John's HUD as a wave of low-frequency static rippled through his neural lace. "Chief, the sensor grid is registering a high-density energy signature directly beneath our feet. This fortress wasn't abandoned. Something is still moving below the ice floor." Before they could deploy a thermal probe, a deep, rhythmic scraping sound echoed up through the stone foundations, the sound of something colossal shifting its weight inside the deep dark of the earth, a mechanical, ancient breathing that made the ice on the walls weep. Far across the narrow sea, beneath a violent, storm-filled sky that hung like an angry purple bruise over the Dothraki plains, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and parched earth. Daenerys Targaryen stood outside her silk tent, her long, silver-gold hair whipped into a frenzy by a hot gale that carried the distant rumble of thunder. The campfires of the Carlisle were dim orange sparks in the twilight, the horse lords silent as they watched her stand beside a burning iron brazier. In her hands she held the dark green dragon egg. It was no longer stone, it was a living furnace. The scales were white-hot, burning through the leather gloves she wore, its surface pulsing with a brilliant, golden light that cast long, dancing shadows across her pale face. She closed her eyes, and the prophetic dreams consumed her mind. She saw an ocean of white snow crossing shattered kingdoms, breaking the walls of stone and turning the blue seas to ice. She saw a green-armored giant standing beneath a rain of falling stars, his rifle aimed into an endless closing darkness. And then she heard the dragons scream, a sound of pure, primordial fire that ripped through the winter clouds, their shadows flying over endless fields of white death. Crack! Daenerys opened her eyes, her breath catching in her throat as a sharp crystalline snap echoed from her hands. A thin, jagged fracture had opened across the base of the dark green egg, and from the narrow seam, a single wisp of black smoke rose into the desert air, carrying a heat so pure it made the surrounding space shimmer. "Khaleesi," Sir Jorah Mormont said, stepping out from the tall grass, his face pale with a growing existential dread as he looked at the cracking stone. "The port at Pentos, they say the winter has hit the northern coast of Westeros. The sea is freezing, Daenerys. The old powers are waking up." "The fire is ready, Jorah," she whispered, her violet eyes locked on the northern stars. "The line is waiting." And then the true scale of the apocalypse was revealed to the north. High up on a ridge of the Frost Fangs, looking out over a vast glacier valley that stretched north into the eternal white dark, the Master Chief and his reconnaissance team halted at the edge of a precipice. The storm had suddenly ceased, leaving the world in a state of absolute, terrifying stillness beneath a sky illuminated by a pale, green aurora. Below them, the valley was alive.
An enormous army of the dead numbering tens of thousands, an ocean of frozen flesh and burning, star-blue eyes was marching silently through the canyon floor.
There were dead wildlings, missing rangers, and ancient creatures of the deep north, ice bears, skeletal direwolves, and giant humanoids whose massive ribs were encrusted with frost, moving with a flawless, terrifying coordination that produced no sound. At the head of the vanguard, 5 white walkers rode upon horses of pure ice, their crystalline armor shifting colors like liquid mercury under the aurora light. Their star-blue eyes burned with a brilliant, regal intensity as they looked toward the south, toward the wall that stood like a thin white thread against the darkness.
They were not testing the line anymore.
They were gathering for a continental war, total conquest, an unstoppable tide of frost that had been summoned by the fire of humanity's futuristic science.
"Gods protect us," Tanaka whispered, her rifle hanging loose in her hand as she stared at the biblical scale of the horde. "We can't stop that many."
Not with 30 rounds a man. Channel 117 did not answer.
He stood at the edge of the cliff, his green titanium armor black against the snow, his golden visor reflecting the ocean of blue stars below. On his internal display, the long night signal exploded into a continuous high-density stream, the waveform pulsing like a siren inside his mind. Deep beneath the ice north of the wall, a massive grinding roar shook the mountains to their foundations. It was a sound that predated the history of man, the sound of something colossal, something ancient and terrible waking up completely from the bedrock of the world to meet the invaders from the stars. The true long night had begun. The factions of men remained blind and divided, and as the Master Chief adjusted his grip on his weapon, he knew the fire and ice were moving toward an inevitable cataclysmic collision that would either decide the survival of the living or leave the world a kingdom of nothing but ice. Chapter 11. When the wall trembled, the black northern night did not simply fall, it buried Castle Black beneath a suffocating shroud of white fury. Hurricane force, winds screamed across the landscape, throwing sheets of needle-sharp ice against the ancient stone keeps. The high-intensity halogen floodlights, frozen over and flickering erratically, were reduced to weak, amber eyes that barely punctured the roaring dark.
Along the perimeter, Marines from the 10th Shock Troops, the heavy charcoal battle dress caked in thick, vitreous plates of frost, laboured alongside shivering brothers of the night, watched to drop interlocking titanium barricades into the deepening drifts. In the centre of the courtyard, the greasy, copper-thick smoke of burning funeral pyres rose in choked columns, a desperate, never-ending ritual to ensure the dead stayed quiet beneath the snow. Every few minutes, a low, subterranean vibration rolled through the flagstones, a deep bass hum that travelled down from the jagged peaks of the frost fens miles away, where the damaged infinity remained locked inside its glacier prison. The atmosphere was a heavy, suffocating mix of total sleep deprivation, absolute military discipline, and a quite creeping hopelessness that left a taste of iron on the tongue. Then the wall began to tremble. It did not begin with a crash, but with a deep, primordial groan that vibrated through the bedrock of the world. Inside the ancient ice tunnels beneath the structure, the 700-foot precipice began to twist under an unseen, colossal pressure. Networks of jagged, spiderweb cracks shot through the frozen walls with the sound of breaking bone, venting a pale white mist that smelled of ozone and ancient earth. Beneath the translucent, frozen surfaces, a cold, electric blue light began to pulse, not the familiar orange flicker of the campfires, but a rhythmic, mathematical illumination that beat in sync with the infinity's failing reactors. Simultaneously, the tactical radios died. A deafening roar of white noise tore through the headsets, cutting off the command staff and plunging Castle Black into an absolute communication blackout. "Chief!" The weapon's voice snapped inside John's helmet, her blue avatar materializing on his display interface, her digital form trembling violently. "The long night signal is gone off the charts. The electromagnetic spike isn't just expanding, it's writing the base level code of our network. It's behaving like a living pulse, drawing energy directly from our primary reactor core to feed the structural resonance inside the ice." Master Chief Petty Officer John 117 stood entirely motionless upon the shaking battlements, his olive drab and Jolnir armor caked with frost, his gauntlets locked onto the frozen stone railing. His golden visor did not blink as he looked down at his internal HUD, where the seismic metrics were scrolling in a chaotic red waterfall of system failures. He had overseen defensive lines across a dozen colonial worlds, had stood against the viral consumption of the Flood and the plasma fire of the Covenant, but this conflict was expanding beyond the boundaries of standard warfare. The environment itself was transforming, its ancient parameters shifting to purge the foreign technology that had broken through the sky. "Palmer, report," Chief said over the short-range line-of-sight net. "The lower Sally ports are buckling, Chief." Palmer's voice crackled through the static, tight with operational strain. The ice inside the structural arches is shifting 2 inches every 10 seconds.
The engineers are trying to shore up the timber supports with structural foam, but the culvert's too deep.
It's eating the foam before it can cure.
This-eyed John Snow stood with his hands gripped onto the hilt of Longclaw, his black wool cloak whipped into a frenzy by the screaming wind. His face was pale, his purple-grey eyes wide with an ancient, instinctual dread as he listened to the ice groan above their heads. "The wall has never done this, Chief," John said, his voice a low rasp that was nearly swallowed by the gale. "The old stories said the first men built it with stone and blood to keep the winter out. But this sounds like a wolf waking up inside its skin."
"The barrier is failing," Chief said, his gravelly baritone perfectly flat,
Perfectly disciplined. Get the recruits into the secondary keeps. Secure the ammunition crates.
"If the tunnels collapse, we lose our fallback positions." "There is no fallback position, John Snow said, looking out into the vast, dark sea of the haunted forest, where thousands of pale blue lights were beginning to ignite through the trees like dead stars.
If the wall falls, the realm falls with it.
Inside the dark, narrow command center of the Infinity, 3 miles away in the mountain passes, Captain Thomas Lasky stood before a sputtering tactical holotable, his face illuminated by rows of flashing red failure runes. The air inside the dreadnought was cold enough to turn a man's breath to silver mist, the primary life support systems operating at less than 15% capacity to preserve the emergency batteries. Reactor containment fields are fluctuating at 92%, the operations lieutenant reported, his hands fine across a keyboard slick with frost. "The energy feedback from beneath the planet's crust is spiking every time the signal pulses. We're picking up massive structural groans along decks 14 through 30. Lasky wiped a layer of condensation from his brow, his eyes shadowed by an immense, soul-crushing weariness. The casualty lists were a manual for extinction. 98 Marines were currently confined to the triage bays with severe frost injuries, and their ammunition reserves had dropped below 30 rounds per man for the primary battle rifles. They were an isolated unit cut off from known space with a broken ship and a dwindling magazine. Chief Lasky said over the static-filled ship-to-shore relay, "We're picking up massive seismic anomalies directly north of your position. The weapon is trying to clean up the data, but the scale doesn't make sense, John. It looks like a tectonic fracture expanding under the ice shelf."
Inside the Spartan's helmet, the weapon's image flickered, her eyes wide as she reviewed the raw data streams she had managed to harvest before the comms died.
"Chief, it's not a tectonic fracture. My long-range sonar managed to map a section of the bedrock 5 kilometers beneath the polar ice cap.
There are massive geometric silhouettes buried in the stone.
They are hundreds of meters tall, composed of a dense crystalline material that matches the molecular signature of the White Walker's armor.
They are natural formations, John.
They are architecture, an ancient planetary deployment network that's been dormant for 10,000 years, and our ship's reactor just handed them the ignition sequence." She looked up at him, her digital voice laced with a profound cosmic terror.
"The White Walkers aren't just an army, Chief. They're a security protocol, and they're about to execute a full system purge."
South, far across the flooded plains of the Neck and into the rain-slicked towers of King's Landing,
The capital was descending into a parallel madness. A cold, unseasonal storm hammered against the pale pink stone keeps of the Red Keep, the slate-grey rain washing the filth of Flea Bottom into Blackwater Bay.
Inside the dark, candlelit council chambers, the air was thick with the scent of damp wool, burning tallow, and intense political paranoia. Southern lords and wealthy merchants argued in low, venomous voices, their eyes darting to the doors, as rumours from the north grew more terrifying with every passing hour. Reports of empty villages, of frozen armies that moved without sound, and of a 3-mile iron castle that had fallen from the firmament were treated not as an existential crisis, but as a political threat to the Iron Throne.
Eddard Stark sat alone in his solar, a single candle illuminating the desperate letters from his son and Lord Commander Mormont.
His face was a mask of grim, noble sorrow, the heavy silver chain of the hand feeling like an iron collar around his neck. Ear-blind, Ned whispered into the empty room, his grey eyes weary and full of a profound, tragic clarity. In the council room, they spend hours plotting their small betrayals, calculating the interest owed to the Lannisters, and arguing over who should wear a golden crown. I tell them the dead are gathering at the wall, and they smile behind their silk sleeves. They are preparing a civil war for a chair of old swords, completely blind to the white death that is marching down to take them all.
Our own greed will destroy us before the winter even reaches the Trident. The interior of the Infinity itself had begun to feel increasingly haunted. Deep within the lower engineering decks, where the automated systems had gone dark and unexplained, vitreous frost was spreading across the titanium bulkheads, forming intricate geometric patterns that mirrored the spiral symbols found in the snow beyond the wall. The emergency strobe lights flickered in sync with the long night signal surges, casting long, dancing shadows through the long corridors. Inside the damaged communication arrays, technicians reported hearing faint, corrupted whispers, hidden within the white noise voices that didn't sound human, repeating mathematical sequences in a cold, grinding language that defied translation. Foreigner subsystems, long since deactivated after the ship's arrival, would briefly blink into life without authorization, their blue hard-light interfaces flitting erratically before dissolving back into static. Something ancient beneath Westeros was interacting with the ship's neural architecture, reaching through the titanium hull to touch the machine's iron heart. To witness the true scale of the apocalypse, the Master Chief led a high-risk reconnaissance mission 5 kilometers north of the wall after a massive seismic disturbance tore through the valley. The Pelican dropship glided through the blinding whiteout conditions in a low, pressurized hover, its active camouflage panels struggling to maintain their distortion field against the sub-zero density of the storm.
Below them, the world was a landscape of mythic, biblical horror.
The vast valley of the Frostfangs was illuminated by a pale, green aurora that danced across the clouds, casting a hellish light across the snowfields.
Below, the White Walker vanguard had assembled in its entirety.
An ocean of frozen flesh, tens of thousands of dead wildlings, missing rangers, and ancient creatures of the deep north marched in flawless, silent coordination through the pass.
Skeletal giants whose rib cages were caked in ice moved alongside mountain bears and ancient wolves, their movements perfectly synchronized a tidal wave of frost that left the earth dead in its wake.
At the center of the valley, the army had gathered around an enormous jagged crack that had opened in the ice shelf.
The fissure was hundreds of meters wide, glowing with a brilliant electric blue light that pulsed like a dying star.
Standing atop the high ridges surrounding the crack were 6 white walkers, their crystalline armor shifting colors like liquid mercury under the aurora light. They did not move. They stood like regal, ancient kings, their star-blue eyes fixed on the fissure below. They were conducting a coordinated excavation, using the negative energy field of the long night signal to rip the earth open, their movements guided by a strategic intelligence that surpassed anything the command staff had anticipated. Suddenly a violent tremor tore through the canyon. The ice inside the crack shattered with a cataclysmic roar, and from the deep dark below, an enormous shape began to rise slowly beneath the frozen earth. It was a silhouette of colossal proportions, its crystalline skin reflecting the blue glare of the fire, a monument of ancient, forgotten power that predated the history of man. It did not fully reveal its shape through the fog, but the sheer kinetic force of its awakening sent a massive shockwave tearing across the valley, knocking the Pelican dropship sideways and forcing Tanaka to burn her remaining auxiliary fuel to maintain altitude.
"Chief," the weapon's voice screamed over the internal net, her image completely stripped of color as she reviewed the data.
The signal is no longer localized to the north.
The pulse just breached the southern continental shelf.
It's spreading across all of Westeros simultaneously.
Back at Castle Black, the climax of the night hit with an absolute, terrifying finality. The wall violently trembled.
Enormous blocks of ice, some the size of a standard Pelican dropship, detached from the upper parapets, crashing into the courtyard below in a deafening shower of white stone and splinters.
Alarms screamed across the command keeps as the primary fusion generators suffered a total catastrophic short-circuit, plunging the entire fortress into a total darkness broken only by the dim, orange glow of the watchfires. The Black Brothers of the Watch fell to their knees in the slush, weeping silently or screaming prayers to gods who could no longer hear them, believing the end of the world had arrived. Master Chief stood at the edge of the western wall, his MA5D rifle slung across his chest, his golden visor locked onto the northern horizon. Through the thick flurry of the storm, he could hear the sound of ancient silver horns echoing through the wilderness, a sound that had not been heard in 8,000 years. It was the call of the Winter Kings, signaling the final deployment of an empire of ice. Far across the narrow sea, beneath a violent thunderstorm that ripped through the Dothraki plains, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and burning grass. Daenerys Targaryen stood inside her silk tent, her long silver hair falling over her shoulders as she held her hands against the dark green dragon egg. The stone scales were white-hot, pulsing with a sudden furious light that illuminated the dark interior of the keep. Crack! A sharp crystalline snap echoed through the silence. A wide, jagged seam tore open across the face of the egg, and from the dark interior a small, leathery wing-tip with sharp black claws thrust out into the light, accompanied by a low, primordial hiss of smoke and fire. "The long night," Daenerys whispered, her violet eyes reflecting the golden light of the cracking stone as a distant thunder shook the earth. "It's here, deep beneath the ice of the northern valley,
The enormous shape continued its slow, apocalyptic rise, its blue eyes opening within the dark bedrock of the world. The arrival of the Infinity had accelerated the coming end of days, acting as a technological catalyst that had set the ancient systems of the planet on fire. Humanity remained divided by their gold, their thrones, and their small betrayals, completely unaware that the board was about to be smashed to pieces. The apocalypse had already begun. The old world was ending, and as the Master Chief stood up on the trembling barrier of ice, his hand closing around his weapon, he knew the final hour had arrived. The winter was no longer a shadow on the wall, it was the tide of death, and the dark was about to take it all. Chapter 12, the first fall of winter. The darkness that swallowed Castle Black was not merely the absence of light, it was a living, suffocating entity. A hurricane-force blizzard screamed across the northern wilderness, devouring the ancient stone keeps and burying the courtyard beneath mountainous drifts. The high-intensity halogen floodlights, usually blinding, were choked down to pale dying embers that could barely pierce 10 feet into the whiteout. Marines of the 10th Shock Troops and black-cloaked brothers of the Night's Watch rushed blindly across the slick, ice-choked battlements, a shout swallowed instantly by the roaring gale. Along the parapets, Spartan Roman force stood entirely motionless against the screaming winds, their heavy armor shedding sheets of frost, their rifles aimed into an endless void. Every few minutes, a deep, mechanical tremor vibrated through the frozen earth, the death throes of the Infinity's failing auxiliary reactors echoing down from the distant glacier prison. Beneath the flickering, wind-battered torchlight of the inner courtyard, terrified Night's Watch recruits knelt in the slush, praying to old gods and new, while the distant, mournful wail of ancient horns echoed continuously from the black forests beyond.
The atmosphere was a heavy, suffocating shroud of absolute military desperation and ancient, inescapable doom.
Then the world broke. It began as a subterranean groan, a sound so deep it rattled the teeth in the marine skulls.
The 700-foot precipice of the wall violently shuddered.
Beneath the frozen surface, gigantic, jagged cracks spiderwebbed across the ice, glowing with a brilliant, volatile blue light that illuminated the storm from within. The pressure was impossible, a tectonic shear force ripping through architecture that had stood for 8,000 years.
Inside the wormwalk's ancient ice tunnels began to implode.
Frozen stone exploded apart, sending lethal shrapnel tearing through the corridors. Structural failure.
Commander Palmer's voice screamed over the static-filled tactical net, her transmission barely audible over the deafening roar of collapsing ice.
The western shelf is giving way. Fall back.
A massive section of the wall's upper ridge sheared off entirely.
Millions of tons of solid ice and ancient rock cascaded downward in a catastrophic avalanche, plunging into the darkness below, striking the earth with a kinetic impact that threw men from their feet. A cloud of pulverized ice and white dust exploded across Castle Black, burying the western barricades instantly.
The wall had not been entirely destroyed, but the impossible had happened.
The great shield of the realms of men had cracked. It could fall. Deep inside the buckling subterranean tunnels, the air was a choking fog of ice dust and panic.
Jon Snow threw himself forward as the ceiling gave way, his hands grabbing the collar of the terrified young recruit.
He dragged the boy backward just as a block of ice, the size of a warhorse, slammed into the stone floor where they had been standing seconds before.
Jon's heart hammered against his ribs, his lungs burning with the freezing dust.
He looked around at the hardened men of the Watchmen who had faced wildlings and murderers now consumed by an absolute, weeping terror. Everything they had believed about their invincible fortress was a lie.
Through the chaos, a towering silhouette of green titanium moved against the tide of fleeing men.
The Master Chief did not run. He stepped directly under a collapsing structural arch, his Enjolnir energy shields flaring brilliant gold as he caught a failing timber beam.
The sheer weight drove his armoured boots inches into the solid stone floor, the servos in his suit whining in a high-pitched protest.
Move! Chief's deep, gravelly voice boomed over external speakers, cutting through the panic with absolute command.
Jon Snow pulled the recruit past the Spartan, looking back just as Chief hurled the timber aside and vaulted out of the collapsing tunnel, the ceiling imploding a fraction of a second behind his boots.
As Jon, 1917, stood in the ruined courtyard, his visor analysing the impossible seismic patterns scrolling across his HUD in red, a cold realisation settled into his surgically enhanced mind. The wall was not just breaking from the wind or the sheer weight of the ice.
It was reacting to something moving beneath the earth itself.
This was no longer a military siege. It was a planetary-scale catastrophe.
Miles away,
locked inside the crushing grip of the frost fangs, the Infinity had become a haunted ship. Vitreous, unnatural frost spread like creeping ivy across the sealed titanium corridors of the lower decks.
Unexplained blackouts rolled through the ship in tandem with the blue flashes of the long night signal.
Damaged Forerunner subsystems, dormant since the slipspace
jump began activating without command inputs, casting pale, hard-like geometric patterns against the bulkheads.
Inside the static of the emergency communication channels, the technicians heard ancient, overlapping whispers, a language of grinding ice and empty voids.
Inside the dim, red-lit command center, Captain Thomas Lasky stood over a flickering holotable.
His uniform was rumpled, his face carved with the deep, hollow lines of absolute exhaustion.
The casualty reports were rising exponentially, and the reactor containment fields were failing faster than the engineering teams could bypass the frozen lines.
"We are bleeding out, Captain," the operations officer whispered, his breath pluming in the freezing air.
The seismic surges are tearing the slipspace drive mounts apart.
If the hull buckles any further, the ship will be permanently immobilized.
Lasky closed his eyes.
The weight of his command was absolute, a crushing burden of 50,000 souls stranded at the edge of the universe.
"Halt all repairs on the drive," Lasky ordered, his voice quiet but carrying the heavy, tragic finality of a captain burying his ship.
"Reroute all remaining power to the localized defense grids and the hydroponics bays.
Begin drafting contingency protocols for the permanent establishment of a terrestrial colony.
The Infinity will never fly again.
This is our fortress now."
Beside him, the weapon's holographic avatar flickered into existence.
She was stripped of all her usual color, her digital eyes wide with a cosmic, unadulterated terror. She expanded the holographic map of Westeros across the table.
It was no longer just a topography of mountains and rivers.
Beneath the surface, the map pulsed with thousands of interconnected blue veins.
Captain Chief, the weapon's voice trembled over the open channel.
"I've mapped the long night signal.
It's not just beneath the wall.
It's spreading beneath the entire continent. The weirwood groves, the ancient ruins, the magma vents, they are all part of a single planetary energy network.
And it is resonating directly with the Infinity's leaking slipspace radiation."
She looked up, her avatar glitching as a violent tremor shook the dreadnought. The long night signal was never a transmission. It is an awakening process.
The White Walkers aren't the source.
They are just the first symptom.
Far to the south, the old world was dying in its sleep.
A violent, unseasonal storm hammered the red keep of King's Landing, the rain lashing against the black stone towers like an ocean of tears. In the filthy, crowded streets below,
commoners huddled in the dark,
whispering terrified prayers to the Seven,
speaking of divine punishment
and demons falling from the sky. Inside the cavernous, torchlit chambers of the castle, the nobles drank wine and argued over copper pennies and minor slights. They were entirely, blissfully consumed by their petty grasp for power while the winter deepened.
Eddard Stark sat alone in the Tower of the Hand.
He read the fragmented, frantic raven scrolls from Castle Black by the trembling light of a single candle.
His hands shook.
The words painted a picture of apocalypse, a broken wall, giants of green steel, an ocean of the dead. Ned set the parchment down, a profound, suffocating grief washing over him.
He thought of his children of Rod trying to hold the north, of Bran, of Arya, and Sansa sleeping in a castle surrounded by vipers.
The Seven Kingdoms were doomed. The corruption, the pride, the endless denial, humanity's greatest weakness was its own arrogant reflection.
They would never unite in time. The realm was already a corpse, it just hadn't stopped bleeding yet.
Across the narrow sea, the Dothraki plains were convulsing beneath a supernatural tempest.
Thunder shook the earth with the force of breaking mountains.
Lightning the color of dragon fire illuminated
The rolling, black storm clouds. Inside her wind-battered silk tent, Daenerys Targaryen lay thrashing upon her bed, her mind consumed by prophetic dreams that burned like physical fire. She saw the great wall of ice cracking apart beneath a torrent of blue flame. She saw armies of the dead, countless as the stars swallowing the green kingdoms whole. She saw massive ancient shadows awakening beneath mountains of ice.
And standing alone against the endless winter, she saw a towering, green-armored warrior, his face a mask of golden glass, aiming a weapon of thunder into the dark.
She woke with a gasp, her skin slick with sweat, the smell of ash drifting through the tent.
She looked toward the burning iron brazier. The 3 petrified dragon eggs were glowing with an intense, internal heat, radiating a warmth that pushed back the chill of the storm.
As Daenerys slowly approached, falling to her knees on the rugs, she heard a sound that made her heart stop.
Crack! A deep, jagged fissure split the surface of the blackened red egg.
A thin tendril of smoke hissed into the air, and from within the ancient stone a tiny, leathery claw scratched against the shell.
It was a mythic, terrifying moment of pure genesis, the fire returning to a world that was freezing to death. Beyond the broken wall, the true scale of the nightmare was finally laid bare.
Master Chief piloted a Pelican dropship in a low, emergency reconnaissance vector, fighting the catastrophic wind shear as he crossed over the partially collapsed section of the ice.
The whiteout conditions swallowed the floodlights, forcing Jon to rely entirely on the corrupted fauna telemetry feeding into his HUD.
The storm parted for a fraction of a second, revealing a gigantic, frozen valley bathed in the eerie blue light of the auroras above.
The White Walker army had reached an unimaginable biblical scale. Hundreds of thousands of the undead stretched across the snowfields, an endless crawling ocean of dead flesh, rusted iron, and glowing blue eyes that filled the horizon. Moving among them were massive ice-covered creatures, skeletal mammoths, and ancient rotting giants that shook the earth with their strides. Standing atop a jagged ridge of black ice elevated above the endless horde stood a White Walker. The Pelican hovered in the screaming wind 50 meters from the ridge.
Master Chief stood at the open rear ramp, the freezing gale tearing at his armor, his MA-5D rifle raised.
The White Walker did not move to attack. It simply turned its ancient, regal head.
Through the swirling snow, the creature's star blue eyes met the golden reflection of the Spartan's visor.
The air around the Walker distorted with an unnatural, absolute zero field. There was no hatred in its stare, no mindless rage. There was only a cold, calculating, and terrifyingly intelligent understanding. The ancient warrior of ice and the armored soldier of the stars looked at one another across the void, two apex weapons of different eras, recognizing the absolute inevitability of their war. Then the great surge hit. The long night signal did not merely pulse, it detonated.
Across the entire continent of Westeros, the ancient network activated simultaneously.
Deep within the Wolfswood and the Godswood of Winterfell, the carved faces of the weirwood trees began to bleed glowing, faint red sap.
In the deep deserts of Essos, the dragon egg in Daenerys' hands heated to the temperature of molten iron. Aboard the Infinity, every dormant foreigner console flared to blinding life, projecting massive holographic spheres of the planet's shifting core. The weapon's avatar screamed over the tactical net, the audio distorting with the sheer volume of data flooding the ship. Chief, the energy signatures aren't just in the north.
They are waking up beneath the crypts of Winterfell, beneath the ruins of Valyria, beneath the Red Keep itself.
The White Walkers were only the vanguard. The Master Chief stood up on the ramp of the Pelican, the snow swirling around his green armor, staring down at the endless ocean of the dead. Far to the south, Ned Stark lowered his head into his hands, mourning a world that was already gone. In the command center, Captain Lasky stared at the holographic map of the continent, lighting up like a funeral pyre, accepting that the Infinity was now the final tomb of mankind. And across the sea, Daenerys Targaryen wept as the stone shell fell away, revealing a creature of living flame in the dark. And far, far beyond the wall, deep beneath the eternal ice of the lands of always winter, the earth split open completely.
An entity of colossal, incomprehensible scale rose slowly from the shattered glaciers, a shadow so vast it blotted out the pale auroras, its ancient eyes burning like dead blue suns in the blizzard.
The old world was dead. The Infinity had accidentally turned the key, and the ancient, buried gods of Westeros had returned to reclaim the surface. The fire had hatched, the ice had broken, and humanity stood catastrophically unprepared between them.
Winter was no longer coming. Winter had arrived. Epilogue. The cold forged the silence that followed. The trembling of the world was worse than the roar of the storm.
Beyond the broken base of Castle Black, the sky had turned the color of a bruised iris, illuminated from behind by a pale, continuous green aurora that cast long, sickly shadows across the fractured ice field.
The partial collapse had left a jagged, bleeding wound in the center of the 700-foot barrier, a monumental V-shaped breach where millions of tons of ancient ice had sheared away, leaving the raw, black bedrock of the mountain exposed like an unburied bone. Steam still rose from the thermal scars left by the Infinity's auxiliary systems, freezing instantly into a fine, white powder that drifted through the courtyard like ash.
Castle Black, the unbroken sentinel inside the ruined Sally Port, the flickering light of a single fusion lantern cast a stark, clinical glare across the olive-drab titanium armor of the Master Chief.
He stood entirely motionless, his heavy gauntlet resting on the grip of his slung assault rifle. His internal heads-up display was a muted canvas of amber warning icons. His energy shields were slowly cycling at less than 30% capacity, the suit's thermal regulators humming a low, mechanical protest against the supernatural, sub-zero drain of the environment.
With a soft chime, the weapon materialized on his terminal display.
Her digital form was pale, almost translucent, her eyes wide with a quiet, analytical terror that she could no longer suppress.
The long night signal has stabilized, Chief, she whispered, her voice carrying a thread of digital static.
But it's not a broadcast anymore. It's an ambient constant. The energy signatures I detected beneath the continent, they've locked into a permanent harmonic resonance with our ship's leaking slipspace drive. The planet didn't just wake up.
It's rewriting its own operational parameters to freeze us out.
John 118 looked out through the fractured stone archway toward the northern horizon.
Through the high-resolution zoom of his visor, he could see them miles away, standing like statues of ancient ice atop the jagged ridges of the Frostfangs.
The White Walker vanguard remained stationary, their star-blue eyes burning through the white fog, silently watching the ruined fort. They were not retreating.
They were waiting for the fires of the Infinity to go out.
We need a full inventory of the remaining munitions, Chief said, his deep, gravelly baritone perfectly flat, perfectly disciplined.
Ration the lead cells. Every round has to count. And if we run out,
She asked softly.
then we find another way to hold the line.
Jon Snow stepped into the light of the lantern, his black matted furs encrusted with frost, his face pale and drawn from sheer physical exhaustion.
He held Longclaw loosely in his leather-wrapped hand, the rippled Valyrian steel dark and brooding in the dim glare. He looked up at the green, titanium giant, his purple-grey eyes steady with the quiet, solemn respect that had been forged in the fire of the gate. "The men of the Watch are calling you the Iron Knight, Chief," Jon said, his voice a low rasp against the wind. "They think you're a god sent down from the stars to save them." "I'm a soldier," Chief replied, his visor tilting down toward the young ranger. "Gods don't need ammo." Jon let out a slow, heavy breath, his gaze drifting to the massive, cracked foundation of the wall above them. "My father always told me that the wall would stand as long as the men of the Night's Watch stayed true to their vows.
But our steel is old, and your machines are breaking.
If the winter comes down with the strength we saw tonight, our vows will be nothing but words written in the snow." "Vows are standard protocol," Chief said simply. "They keep a soldier standing when the line breaks. Your men stayed. That's what matters."
The infelicitous fortress 3 miles into the mountain passes, the Unskinfinity sat half-buried inside its glacial trench, its heavy titanium hull completely frosted over.
Inside the dim, red-lit command center, Captain Thomas Lasky stood alone before the viewport, staring out into the whiteout conditions of the valley.
The dreadnought was silent now, the great mechanical roar of its primary engines gone, replaced by the low, oscillating whine of auxiliary emergency batteries. The latest logistics reports lay on the console before him, a record of dwindling resources, rising casualties, and total structural isolation.
Asterisk ammunition remaining 24% kinetic stockpiles. Asterisk active personnel capacity 42% combat ready. Asterisk reactor stability 11% containment level. Critical asterisk orbital communication terminated. Lasky reached down, his fingers tracing the cold metal rim of the terminal.
He knew the truth that his officers refused to say aloud. The Infinity would never fly again. It was no longer a starship traveling the void. It had become an iron island, the final desperate citadel of mankind wedged into the prehistoric bedrock of a primitive world. "We survive here, Sarah," Lasky said quietly into his headset, his voice full of a weary, disciplined compassion as Palmer reported from the lower armory. "We fortify the keeps, we teach the locals how to hold a perimeter, and we make sure our fire doesn't go dark. If this is the end of our war, we leave a fortress they'll remember for 1,000 years. King's Landing, the ROT within 500 miles to the south, the unseasonal storm had finally reached the shores of Blackwater Bay. A cold, grey rain fell over the red keep, washing the filth of Flea Bottom into the dark waters of the harbour. Inside the high, candlelit chambers of the royal court, the air was thick with the scent of burning myrrh, old, stone, and an intense, venomous paranoia.
Eddard Stark stood by the window of his solar, his face a mask of profound, noble sorrow as he held a crumpled raven message from his son Robb.
The ink was smeared by wet snow, the words describing an iron mountain from the stars and an ocean of dead things marching through the northern forests.
"They are arguing over the gold," Ned whispered into the empty, shadow-drenched room.
His voice was a hollow rasp, his hand gripping the silver chain of the hand until the metal bit into his skin.
In the great hall below, the lords of the south were already whispering of betrayal, plotting their small alliances, and preparing a civil war for the right to sit upon an uncomfortable iron chair.
They looked at the reports of star warriors and thought of how they could be bought or deceived to destroy their enemies. They looked at the winter and thought of it as a southern political tool. "We are already dead," Ned said softly, his grey eyes fixed on the first flakes of white snow beginning to mix with the rain outside his window. "The lions, the wolves, the stags, we are all just children playing with wooden toys while the mountain is falling. Our own pride will consume us before the dead ever reach the trident." Essos, the spark of generation, across the narrow sea, beneath a sky that tore apart in violent explosions of dragonfire-coloured lightning, the Dothraki grasslands were screaming with the force of an unnatural tempest.
Inside her wind-battered silk tent, Daenerys Targaryen sat beside the burning iron brazier, her silver-gold hair falling over her shoulders.
Her violet eyes were wide, reflecting the brilliant, molten gold light that pulsed from the deep fractures of the dark green egg resting in her lap. The stone scales were gone, turned to hot, living leather that thrummed with a primordial, terrifying heat. Crack! With a sharp, crystalline snap, a wide seam tore open across the center of the shell. From the dark, smoking interior, a small, wet snout tipped with a sharp horn thrust out into the air, letting out a sharp, high-pitched hiss that carried the distinct, sulphurous tang of pure fire. Daenerys did not weep. She smiled, her hand gently reaching out to touch the wet,
black scales of the hatchling.
She felt the vision of the green giant standing upon the ice fading from her mind, replaced by a sudden volatile certainty.
The old world was ending. The lines of kings and titles were turning to ash, and the fire had returned to meet the cold. The horizon of winter far beyond the wall, deep within, the white-out fury of the eternal winter where the long night signal had ripped the earth open. The true army of the others began its final alignment. Hundreds of thousands of the dead, an ocean of white flesh, skeletal ribs, and brilliant, electric blue eyes stretched across the snowfields for miles under a sky illuminated by a pale, purple aurora.
They did not move with rage or mindless hunger. They stood in perfect, silent military formations, their movements coordinated by the 5 ancient winter kings who sat upon horses of solid ice at the vanguard.
And deep beneath the black bedrock of the glacier valley, the colossal shape continued its slow, apocalyptic rise, its ancient eyes opening within the dark stone like dead blue suns. The arrival of the Infinity had accelerated the coming end of days, acting as a technological spark that had set the ancient systems of the planet on fire.
The factions of men remained blind, divided by their gold and their small betrayals, completely unaware that the board was about to be smashed to pieces.
The final hour of the old world had arrived, the fire had hatched, the ice had broken, and humanity stood catastrophically unprepared between them.
The green giant stood upon the broken wall, his rifle aimed into the white fury of the oncoming dark, the last shield of a world that did not even know it was already doomed. Winter was no longer coming. Winter was here.